For 2,000 years, metaphysics claimed to reveal the deepest structure of reality. Philosophers from Plato to Descartes believed pure reason could access truths beyond physical observation. They asked whether God exists, whether the soul is immortal, what causation really is. These questions aimed at something permanent beneath the shifting surfaces of everyday experience. Metaphysics promised knowledge of reality as it truly is, independent of human perception or measurement. This enterprise rested on a powerful assumption. The mind could grasp ultimate truths through logic. By the 20th century, this confidence collapsed with startling speed and near total consensus. Philosophers across different schools agreed that traditional metaphysics had become intellectually bankrupt and methodologically confused. The questions that had consumed Western philosophy for millennia were declared meaningless or unanswerable. Leading thinkers argued that metaphysical statements lack cognitive content altogether, expressing nothing verifiable or falsifiable. What happened was not merely a shift in philosophical fashion, but a fundamental reconception. Philosophy turned away from the quest for ultimate reality toward analysis of language, experience, and scientific method. This transformation originated from multiple converging critiques that dismantled metaphysics from every conceivable angle. Immanuel Kant restricted metaphysical knowledge to the structure of human experience rather than reality itself. Logical positivists declared metaphysical statements literally meaningless because they cannot be empirically verified or logically proven. Wittgenstein argued that philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings about how language actually functions in practice. Willard Van Orman Quine demolished the distinction between analytic and synthetic truths that grounded traditional metaphysics. The linguistic turn redirected philosophy from investigating reality to clarifying the concepts we use to describe it. Understanding why metaphysics died requires examining the deep structural flaws these critics exposed. These were not superficial objections, but demonstrations that metaphysics rested on conceptual confusions and impossible aspirations. The collapse revealed fundamental limits on what human thought and language can accomplish. These limits stem from the nature of knowledge itself, not mere technical difficulties to be overcome. The story encompasses epistemology, philosophy of language, logic, and the relationship between mind and world. It connects to developments in physics, neuroscience, and our evolving understanding of human cognition. The death of metaphysics transformed how we conceive philosophy's proper domain and methods today. Modern analytic philosophy studies concepts, language, and scientific reasoning rather than seeking transcendent metaphysical truths. Continental philosophy explores human existence and experience without claiming access to ultimate reality beyond those phenomena. Both traditions abandoned the classical metaphysical project, though they disagreed about what should replace it. This represents one of the most profound intellectual revolutions in Western thought. What follows traces how this revolution unfolded and what fundamental insights drove it forward. Part 1. The Kantian Revolution: How Metaphysics Became About Us, Not Reality. Immanuel Kant created the first systematic demolition of traditional metaphysics in 1781. His critique of pure reason showed that metaphysical knowledge cannot reach beyond human experience structures. Before Kant, philosophers assumed the mind passively receives information about an independent external reality. They believed careful reasoning could discover how things truly exist apart from anyone observing them. Rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz trusted pure logic to reveal necessary truths about reality's fundamental nature. Empiricists like Locke and Hume grounded knowledge in sensory experience of the external world. Kant rejected both approaches by demonstrating that the mind actively structures all possible experience. He called this his Copernican revolution, analogous to astronomy's shift from geocentric to heliocentric models. Just as Copernicus made the observer move instead of the heavens, Kant made the knowing subject constitute experience. The mind does not passively mirror reality, but imposes forms and categories that organize all experience. Space and time are not features of reality itself, but structures through which humans necessarily experience anything. Causation is not discovered in nature, but imposed by our cognitive apparatus on the sensory data. This reversal had catastrophic implications for traditional metaphysics and its claims about ultimate reality. Kant distinguished between phenomena, things as they appear to us, and noumena, things as they exist independently. We can only know phenomena because knowledge requires our mind's structuring activity operating on sensory input. Noumena remain forever inaccessible because accessing them would require experiencing them through our mental categories. But those categories only apply to phenomena within the realm of possible human experience. Therefore, traditional metaphysics, which claims knowledge of reality beyond experience, attempts the logically impossible. Kant argued that metaphysical claims about God, the soul, free will, and ultimate substance are inherently unknowable. These topics lie beyond any possible experience that could verify or refute statements about them. When reason ventures beyond experience, it generates antinomies, equally valid proofs of contradictory metaphysical conclusions. For example, reason can prove both that the world had a beginning and that it had no beginning. Both proofs appear valid because they exceed the bounds where our concepts legitimately apply. This reveals metaphysics as an illusion generated by reason's natural tendency to seek unconditioned totalities. The key insight was that all knowledge involves synthesis of sensory content with conceptual forms. Intuitions without concepts are blind, Kant famously wrote, while concepts without intuitions are empty. Knowledge requires both the matter of sensation and the form imposed by understanding's categories. Mathematics and logic provide genuine knowledge because they describe these necessary forms of experience itself. Science provides genuine knowledge because it applies categories to empirical content within possible experience boundaries. Metaphysics fails because it tries to apply categories beyond any possible corresponding sensory content. Kant distinguished synthetic a priori knowledge from both purely analytic and purely empirical knowledge. Analytic truths, like all bachelors are unmarried, are true by definition and tell us nothing about the world. Empirical truths are learned through experience and remain contingent on how things happen to be. Synthetic a priori knowledge, like mathematical truths, is necessarily true, but also informative about experience. This is possible because such knowledge describes the universal structures that make experience itself possible. Metaphysics erred by assuming it could provide synthetic a priori knowledge of reality beyond possible experience. The transcendental method Kant pioneered asked what must be true for experience to be possible. Instead of asking what exists independently, he asked what conditions make our actual experience intelligible and coherent. He discovered that space, time, causality and substance are presuppositions of experience rather than independent discoveries. These are transcendental in that they are conditions for the possibility of any experience whatsoever. They are ideal in that they depend on the subject rather than existing independently. Kant called his position transcendental idealism, empirically real but transcendentally ideal. This created a framework where phenomena are fully real and knowable but constitute appearances only. Appearance here does not mean illusion, but rather reality as structured by our cognitive faculties necessarily. The empirical world of science and everyday life is the only world we can meaningfully discuss. Claims about reality independent of all possible experience are not false, but literally unintelligible conceptually. Language and thought cannot operate outside the forms that make them possible in the first place. Metaphysics thus transformed from the study of being itself to the study of being for us. Kant allowed metaphysical concepts like God and immortality as regulative ideas rather than constitutive knowledge. These concepts can guide inquiry and moral thinking without claiming to describe actual existing entities. They function practically and morally, but cannot ground theoretical knowledge claims about what truly exists. Theoretical reason establishes what is. Practical reason determines what ought to be done. Metaphysical ideas belong to the practical domain of ethics and values, not theoretical knowledge. This relegation removed metaphysics from its traditional position as first philosophy providing foundational knowledge. The impact on subsequent philosophy was immediate and profound across all competing schools of thought. German idealists like Fichte, Schelling and Hegel tried to salvage metaphysics by making consciousness itself the ultimate reality. They argued that if the subject structures reality, then subject and reality must ultimately be identical. This led to various forms of absolute idealism where mind or spirit constitutes all reality. Schopenhauer went the opposite direction, positing a blind metaphysical will beneath all phenomenal appearances. These responses accepted Kant's framework while trying to overcome its limitations on metaphysical knowledge. But Kant had exposed a more fundamental problem that later thinkers would radicalize further still. If our conceptual apparatus shapes all possible knowledge, how can we claim certainty about that apparatus itself? The categories and forms Kant described might themselves be contingent features of human psychology or language. This opened the door to later critiques that would question whether Kant's transcendental structures were truly universal. Nietzsche would argue they reflect merely historical and cultural perspectives, not eternal cognitive necessities. The linguistic turn would relocate these structures from the mind to language and social practices. Kant's critique also contained an internal tension that critics immediately identified and exploited relentlessly. He claimed we cannot know things in themselves, yet he asserted they exist and affect our senses. But existence and causation are categories that only apply within phenomenal experience according to his own system. How can noumena cause our sensations if causality only applies to phenomena we actually experience? This apparent contradiction suggested either that Kant failed his own test or that noumena are incoherent. Furthermore, the very notion of a limit to knowledge presupposes knowing both sides of the limit. To say that knowledge stops at phenomena requires comparing phenomena to something beyond them, the noumena. But this comparison would itself be an act of knowledge extending beyond the supposed limit. Kant seemed caught in a paradox. Establishing limits to knowledge requires transgressing those very limits. This structural problem would haunt all attempts to define what lies beyond possible human knowledge. Despite these difficulties, Kant permanently altered metaphysics by showing it investigates our conceptual structures, not independent reality. Metaphysics, after Kant, could no longer innocently assume its concepts directly correspond to external reality structures. Every metaphysical claim now required justification, showing how it relates to possible human experience boundaries. This shifted the burden of proof decisively against traditional speculative metaphysics about ultimate reality. The question became not whether God exists, but whether the concept of God has legitimate use. Not whether time is real, but what role temporality plays in structuring human experience. Kant's legacy created the space for more radical rejections of metaphysics that followed in subsequent generations. If metaphysics only describes our conceptual schemes, perhaps it reduces entirely to psychology or linguistic analysis. If noumena are unknowable, perhaps they are simply nonsensical ideas we should eliminate from philosophical discourse. The logical positivists would take exactly this step, declaring metaphysical statements meaningless rather than merely unknowable. Wittgenstein would radicalize the linguistic aspect, showing how philosophical problems arise from language misunderstandings. Quine would complete the naturalization by eliminating the analytic-synthetic distinction Kant relied upon. But Kant's positive contribution endured even as his specific system was rejected by later philosophy. He established that philosophical investigation must examine the conditions making knowledge possible rather than directly describing reality. He showed that human finitude and particularity inevitably shape what and how we can know anything. He demonstrated that reason has inherent limits. It violates at risk of generating contradictions and illusions. These insights survived even when philosophers abandoned Kant's particular transcendental apparatus and his noumenal-phenomenal distinction. They became permanent features of how modern philosophy understands its own nature and proper scope. Part 2. Hume's Bomb. The Skeptical Crisis that made Kant necessary. David Hume detonated a philosophical crisis in 1748 that exposed metaphysics as rationally groundless. His enquiry concerning human understanding demonstrated that reason cannot justify our most basic beliefs about reality. Hume showed that causation, the soul, external objects, and induction all lack rational foundations whatsoever. These are not merely difficult problems requiring better arguments, but fundamental impossibilities built into human cognition. Metaphysics had always assumed that reason could discover necessary truths about how reality must be. Hume proved that even our most certain everyday beliefs rest on nothing more than custom and habit. The problem of causation struck at the heart of all metaphysical reasoning about necessary connections. When we observe one billiard ball striking another and the second ball moving, what exactly do we perceive? Hume argued we see only constant conjunction, one event regularly following another in our experience. We never perceive the causal power itself, the necessary connection supposedly forcing the second ball to move. All we observe is spatial contiguity, temporal succession, and constant conjunction of similar events repeatedly. The idea of necessary causal power is something our minds add, not something discovered in experience. This observation had devastating consequences for metaphysical claims about substance, God, and ultimate causes everywhere. If we never perceive necessary connections, then reason cannot prove anything must cause anything else necessarily. Every causal claim is merely a generalization from past experience that similar events usually follow patterns. But past experience cannot logically guarantee future events will continue resembling past ones at all. The sun has risen every day of human history, yet this provides zero logical proof it will rise tomorrow morning. We believe it will from custom and habit, not from any rational demonstration of necessity. The problem of induction revealed that scientific reasoning itself lacks rational justification of any compelling kind. Induction reasons from observed cases to unobserved cases, from past to future, from sample to population. All scientific laws depend on this inferential pattern extending beyond what we have actually observed. But what justifies assuming unobserved cases will resemble observed ones in any particular respect whatsoever. If we say past success justifies induction, we are reasoning inductively to justify induction itself. This is circular, using the very method whose reliability we are trying to establish initially. If induction cannot be rationally justified, then neither can any metaphysical principle claiming necessity beyond experience. Metaphysicians had argued that reason can demonstrate God exists necessarily, that substances must underlie properties essentially. These arguments all relied on causal reasoning extended beyond any possible confirmation through direct observation. But Hume showed such reasoning is never logically valid, no matter how convinced we feel. The opposite of any matter of fact remains conceivable without logical contradiction arising anywhere. We can imagine the sun not rising tomorrow without any logical incoherence in the conception itself. Hume distinguished relations of ideas from matters of fact to clarify what reason can actually demonstrate. Relations of ideas include mathematics and logic, statements true by virtue of the meanings of terms alone. These can be known with certainty because their denial produces logical contradiction necessarily and always. All bachelors are unmarried is certain because bachelor means unmarried man by definition alone. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is certain, because it follows from arithmetical rules we stipulated ourselves. But these tell us nothing about whether anything actually exists outside our conceptual systems themselves. Matters of fact concern what actually exists and how the world happens to be currently arranged. The sun rose this morning is a matter of fact learned through experience, not logic. Matters of fact are always contingent. The world could have been otherwise without any contradiction. We know matters of fact only through experience, and experience only shows what has happened already. It never demonstrates what must happen or what will happen with logical necessity binding future events. Therefore, matters of fact remain forever uncertain and vulnerable to revision by contrary future experience. Metaphysics tried to establish necessary truths about matters of fact, which Hume showed is impossible logically. Metaphysicians wanted to prove God necessarily exists, that souls are necessarily immortal, that causation necessarily operates. These claims are not relations of ideas, because their denial is conceivable, without contradiction emerging. But they are also not ordinary matters of fact learned from experience and observation alone. They purport to be necessary truths about existence that reason can demonstrate independently of experience. Hume's fork showed this category is empty. All genuine knowledge is either formal or empirical. This led to Hume's devastating conclusion about metaphysical texts and traditional philosophical speculation generally. He wrote, "If we take any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, let us ask two questions. Does it contain abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Does it contain experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? If it contains neither, commit it to flames, for it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion." This was not rhetorical flourish, but rigorous conclusion from his analysis of cognitive limits. The problem extended to the self and personal identity that metaphysicians treated as substantial soul. When Hume introspectively examined his own mind, he found only particular perceptions, colours, sounds, emotions, thoughts. He never perceived a unified self underlying these experiences as their permanent possessor or substrate. The self appears to be nothing but a bundle of perceptions related by memory and causation. Personal identity is a useful fiction created by smooth transitions between similar perceptions over time. The substantial soul metaphysicians posited is never actually encountered in experience and cannot be rationally demonstrated. Even the external world's existence becomes rationally unjustifiable under Hume's skeptical pressure and logical analysis. All we directly experience are our own perceptions, sense impressions of colours, shapes, sounds. We never experience objects themselves, only sensory appearances that might be caused by external objects. How do we know external objects exist beyond our perceptions, causing them reliably and constantly? We cannot step outside our perceptions to compare them with objects themselves, existing independently. Belief in external objects is natural and practically unavoidable, but not rationally demonstrable through philosophy. Hume's own response was remarkably candid about philosophy's inability to solve these problems it generated. Philosophical skepticism arises in the study, but dissipates when we leave it for ordinary life. Nature is too strong for skeptical reasoning, forcing us to believe and act despite philosophical doubts. We cannot help believing in causation, induction, external objects, and personal identity in daily practice. But philosophy reveals these beliefs rest on instinct and custom, not on rational foundations whatsoever. This split between philosophical theory and practical necessity foreshadowed later pragmatist and naturalist approaches entirely. Hume's critique paralysed metaphysics by showing its core assumptions are rationally indefensible despite feeling natural. Metaphysicians had assumed reason can discover necessary truths about existence, transcending particular experiences completely. They believed careful analysis would reveal the essential nature of substance, causation, the self, and God. Hume demonstrated these beliefs arise from psychological mechanisms, not from rational insight into reality's structure. Association of ideas, custom, and imagination generate metaphysical concepts that we then mistake for knowledge. The entire metaphysical enterprise rested on this fundamental confusion between psychology and logic permanently. The implications ramified through every area of metaphysical investigation without exception or limitation anywhere. Cosmological arguments for God's existence assume every event has a cause and trace back to first cause. But Hume showed causation is not rationally demonstrable, merely habitual expectation from past conjunction observation. Ontological arguments claim God's existence follows necessarily from the concept of a perfect being. But existence is not a predicate that can be included in a definition yielding knowledge about reality. Arguments for the soul's immortality assumed an immaterial substance persists through time as thinking subject. But Hume showed we never perceive such a substance, only streams of particular perceptions instead. The self is constructed from memory and association, not discovered as a metaphysical entity. Claims about free will assumed an agent causes actions without being determined by prior causes. But this violates the principle that every event has causes while somehow remaining an event itself. The entire framework of metaphysical problems rested on assumptions Hume revealed as psychologically natural but rationally groundless. Kant famously acknowledged that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber and inspired the critical philosophy. Hume had shown empiricism leads to radical skepticism about knowledge if pursued consistently and rigorously. Kant sought to rescue science and mathematics from this skeptical threat by finding rational foundations. His solution was to argue that necessary structures belong to the mind rather than reality. Causation is not discovered in nature, but imposed by understanding on experience as condition of possibility. This preserved necessity while accepting Hume's point that we never perceive it in objects themselves. But Kant's solution still accepted Hume's fundamental insight. Metaphysical knowledge of reality transcending experience is impossible. Kant relocated metaphysical necessity from the world to the structure of possible experience and cognition. This saved science, but at the cost of traditional metaphysical claims about ultimate reality itself. Later, philosophers would radicalize Hume's skepticism further still, arguing even Kant's transcendental structures lack justification. Logical positivists would simply eliminate metaphysics as meaningless, rather than relocating it to consciousness. Quine would naturalize Humean skepticism, showing that even the analytic-synthetic distinction cannot be sustained coherently. Hume's legacy was the recognition that human reason has fundamental limits that metaphysics perpetually violates. We cannot justify induction, prove causation, demonstrate external objects, or establish personal identity rationally. These beliefs are practically indispensable, but philosophically groundless, arising from nature, not reason. Metaphysics had always tried to transcend these limits through pure rational demonstration of necessary truths. Hume showed this ambition is structurally impossible given how human cognition actually operates in practice. The mind cannot escape its own natural operations to achieve some purely rational standpoint. Part 3. Wittgenstein's Tractatus. The limits of language are the limits of world. Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus, Logico-Philosophicus, appeared in 1921, claiming to solve all philosophical problems. This audacious text argued that philosophy consists entirely of linguistic confusions about logic's nature and limits. Traditional metaphysics failed because it tried to say what can only be shown through language. The book's closing proposition announced its own sentences are nonsensical, a ladder to discard after climbing. Wittgenstein intended to draw a limit to thought by examining language's logical structure from within. Everything outside this limit is not false, but literally meaningless, incapable of expressing anything whatsoever. The Tractatus began with stark ontological declarations that seem like traditional metaphysics at first glance. The world is all that is the case, Wittgenstein wrote, the totality of facts, not things. The world divides into facts, which are combinations of objects in specific configurations or arrangements. Objects are simple, forming the substance of the world and combining in various possible ways. Facts are states of affairs actually obtaining, while states of affairs include all logical possibilities. This appears to offer metaphysical description of reality's fundamental structure and compositional elements. But Wittgenstein's actual project was showing how language pictures the world through sharing logical form. Propositions are pictures of possible states of affairs, representing how things might be arranged in reality. A proposition has the same logical structure as the state of affairs it depicts when true. Just as a map shares spatial relations with the territory it represents accurately. The proposition contains elements corresponding to objects, combined according to the same form as objects combine. This pictorial relationship explains how language can represent reality, despite being different in substance entirely. The picture theory of meaning entailed strict limits on what language can meaningfully express at all. Propositions picture possible arrangements of objects in logical space by mirroring their combinatorial structure. Therefore, meaningful propositions must correspond to possible states of affairs that experience could verify potentially. Natural sciences propositions satisfy this requirement by describing observable configurations of objects in space and time. Mathematics and logic express tautologies and contradictions, propositions, true or false, under all possible arrangements. But metaphysical propositions attempt to say something about logic itself or language's limits transcending possible states. This attempt necessarily fails because language cannot represent its own representational structure from outside that structure. Logic shows itself in language's meaningful use, but cannot be stated in propositions about logic. The logical form shared between language and world makes representation possible in the first place. But this form cannot itself be pictured because any picture would presuppose that same form. Trying to state logical form would require stepping outside logic to describe it, which is impossible. We are always already operating within logic when we use language to represent anything meaningful. Wittgenstein distinguished what can be said from what can only be shown through linguistic practice. Propositions say something by representing possible states of affairs that might obtain or fail to obtain. Logic shows itself in which combinations of signs produce meaningful propositions versus mere nonsense. Metaphysics tries to say what can only be shown, that the world has logical structure. But this is not a further fact to be stated, but the precondition enabling any statements. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world, because language and world share structure. This analysis rendered traditional metaphysical propositions literally nonsensical rather than false or unverifiable even. Consider the proposition. The soul is an immaterial substance that exists beyond spatial and temporal dimensions. This seems grammatically well-formed and philosophically significant about reality's ultimate nature thoroughly. But Wittgenstein argued it violates logical syntax despite appearing grammatically correct in ordinary language structure. Soul, substance, and exists are used outside any possible pictorial connection to experienceable states of affairs. The proposition is not false, but fails to express any coherent thought whatsoever about anything. The same applied to all metaphysical concepts. Being, essence, necessity, God, the absolute, ultimate reality. These are not names of objects in the world whose properties we might discover through investigation. They are pseudo-concepts arising from misunderstanding how language actually functions to represent states of affairs. Being is not a property objects have. It is presupposed in speaking about any object at all. Necessity describes logical relations between propositions, not a special metaphysical glue connecting events mysteriously. God belongs to ethics and the mystical, not to factual discourse about the world's configuration. Wittgenstein drew a sharp distinction between facts in the world and the world's existence itself. Science can describe facts, how objects are arranged, what laws they follow, which events occur. But the mystical concerns not how the world is, but that it is at all. The feeling that the world exists is inexpressible in propositions because existence is not a fact. Facts are particular configurations. Existence is the precondition for any configurations to obtain anywhere. Ethics and aesthetics belong to the mystical, because value is not in the world of facts. The propositions of the Tractatus itself create a notorious paradox that Wittgenstein acknowledged explicitly. The book makes apparent metaphysical claims about objects, facts, logical form, and language's representational nature. But these claims violate the picture theory because they are not empirical propositions about states of affairs. They attempt to say what Wittgenstein argued can only be shown through language's correct use. Therefore, his own propositions are nonsensical, according to his own theory necessarily and unavoidably. He wrote that anyone understanding him eventually recognizes his propositions are nonsensical, a ladder to throw away. This reflexive conclusion was not mere irony, but essential to Wittgenstein's therapeutic conception of philosophy. Philosophy's proper method is showing metaphysical propositions are nonsense, not offering better metaphysical theories instead. The Tractatus aimed to cure philosophical confusion by demonstrating the linguistic sources of metaphysical pseudo-problems. Once we see clearly how language works, metaphysical questions dissolve because we recognize them as nonsense. Philosophy is not a doctrine, but an activity of clarification, elucidating propositions' logical form. The goal is silence, recognizing the limits of sense and ceasing to speak nonsense beyond them. The logical positivists initially embraced Wittgenstein as providing foundations for their anti-metaphysical program and verification principle. They read the Tractatus as showing that meaningful propositions must be verifiable through experience or logic. Metaphysical propositions fail verification and therefore lack cognitive meaning according to this strict criterion. But Wittgenstein actually held a more complex position about showing versus saying carefully distinguished. He thought ethics, aesthetics, and the mystical are profoundly important, though unsayable, in propositions. The positivists treated these as simply meaningless, while Wittgenstein saw them as transcending language's limits. The Tractatus' influence extended far beyond its explicit doctrines to its method and underlying vision. It showed philosophy's proper role is clarifying thought through analyzing language's logical structure carefully. Philosophical problems arise from misunderstanding logic, not from inadequate theories requiring replacement with better ones. The goal is not to solve philosophical problems, but to dissolve them by revealing linguistic confusion. This therapeutic conception transformed how many philosophers understood their discipline's nature and legitimate aspirations altogether. But the picture theory itself faced severe difficulties that Wittgenstein later recognized and abandoned completely. Not all meaningful language pictures states of affairs in the way propositions about physical facts do. Commands, questions, and expressions of intention are meaningful but do not represent possible states of affairs. Even descriptive language uses words in diverse ways, not captured by simple object-name correspondence. General concepts, mathematical propositions, and logical connectives do not picture configurations of objects in logical space. The idea that meaning consists in pictorial relationship proved far too restrictive for actual language. The notion of simple objects forming the world's substance also became problematic under critical examination. Wittgenstein claimed objects are simple, and their combinations form facts about the world, but he never specified what these simple objects are or how to identify them. Are they sense data, physical particles, mathematical points, or something else entirely beyond specification? The entire edifice seemed to require an atomistic metaphysics that was itself questionable and unverifiable. If we cannot identify the simple objects, the picture theory lacks determinate content about language-world relations. The sharp distinction between saying and showing proved difficult to maintain coherently across all contexts. Wittgenstein said logic shows itself, but cannot be stated in propositions about logical structure. But he seemed to state quite a bit about logic, propositions, objects and facts throughout. Either these statements are meaningful, contradicting the theory, or they are nonsensical, undermining the theory's communication. The ladder metaphor suggested understanding comes through the nonsensical propositions despite their lack of meaning. But this is puzzling. How can nonsense convey understanding of anything, including its own nonsensicality? Despite these problems, the Tractatus permanently established that metaphysics confronts limits built into language and thought. Whether through picturing, logical form, or some other mechanism, language functions within constraints not transcendable. Attempts to speak about reality beyond these constraints produce not false statements, but meaningless pseudo-statements. Traditional metaphysics systematically violated these limits by treating existence, necessity and essence as describable properties. The proper response is not better metaphysics, but recognizing metaphysical questions as confused from the start. Silence about the unsayable is not defeat, but wisdom about human finitude and language's nature. Part 4. Logical Positivism's Assault. The Verification Principle. The Vienna Circle formed in the 1920s to eliminate metaphysics through rigorous logical and empirical analysis. Led by Moritz Schlick and Rudolf Carnap, these philosopher-scientists sought to unify all knowledge under scientific method. They believed philosophical problems arose from linguistic confusion, solvable by clarifying language's logical structure systematically. Their central weapon was the verification principle. A statement is meaningful only if empirically verifiable. Metaphysical statements fail this test and therefore lack cognitive meaning entirely, expressing nothing at all. This was not a theory of truth, but a criterion separating sense from nonsense. The verification principle emerged from a marriage between Wittgenstein's picture theory and empiricist epistemology throughout. Wittgenstein showed that meaningful propositions must correspond to possible states of affairs in the world. The positivists added that knowing a proposition's meaning requires knowing what would verify or falsify it. If no possible observation could count for or against a statement, it expresses no factual content. The statement, "God is a transcendent being, beyond space and time," cannot be verified or falsified empirically. Therefore, it is cognitively meaningless, though it might express emotional attitudes or exhortations to act. Alfred Ayer brought logical positivism to the English-speaking world with Language, Truth and Logic in 1936. He was 26 years old and wrote with clarity and polemical force that made positivism widely known. Ayer distinguished strong verification, requiring conclusive confirmation, from weak verification, requiring only probable confirmation through observation. Strong verification proved too restrictive because even scientific laws cannot be conclusively verified by finite observations. Weak verification allowed that a statement is meaningful if observations would make it probable or improbable. But even weak verification faced the immediate problem of universal generalizations that science depends upon fundamentally. The statement all electrons have negative charge cannot be verified by any finite series of observations. We can observe many electrons, but not all electrons, past, present and future, across the universe. Yet this is a paradigmatic scientific statement that verification was meant to preserve as meaningful. The positivists tried various fixes, treating laws as rules rather than statements, or as highly confirmed hypotheses. But each solution created new problems about the status of theoretical terms in science. The distinction between analytic and synthetic statements formed the backbone of the positivist program and worldview. Analytic statements are true by definition alone. All bachelors are unmarried, 2 + 2 = 4. These are meaningful, but tell us nothing about the world, only about our conventions and definitions. Synthetic statements describe the world and require empirical verification. The cat is on the mat. Metaphysical statements fall into neither category. They purport to be synthetic but cannot be verified empirically. Carnap developed the most technically sophisticated version of logical positivism through his principle of tolerance. He argued we are free to construct any logical language we choose for scientific purposes. There is no absolute logical structure to discover, but only frameworks to adopt pragmatically. Metaphysical disputes about what really exists are pseudo-questions, confusing framework choices with factual questions. The question, do numbers exist, has no factual answer, only a choice between linguistic frameworks. Choosing a framework that includes numbers is pragmatic, not a metaphysical discovery about abstract objects. This led Carnap to distinguish internal questions from external questions about existence and reality systematically. Internal questions occur within a linguistic framework. Is there a prime number between 5 and 10? These have definite answers according to the framework's rules and can be verified or proved. External questions ask whether the framework itself corresponds to reality. Do numbers really exist objectively? These are pseudo-questions because we cannot step outside all frameworks to compare them with frameworkless reality. The positivists developed the concept of protocol sentences as the foundation for all meaningful empirical statements. Protocol sentences describe immediate sense experience. There is a red patch in my visual field now. All scientific propositions must be reducible to protocol sentences, or at least connected through logical relations. This was called the reductionist thesis. Every meaningful statement reduces to statements about immediate experience. Theoretical terms in science gain meaning only through connection to observational terms via correspondence rules. Otto Neurath challenged this foundationalism, arguing that protocol sentences themselves are theoretical and revisable throughout. There is no absolutely certain observational base immune to revision in light of new evidence. Even reports of immediate experience are stated in language involving concepts and theoretical commitments. The entire web of scientific statements faces the tribunal of experience collectively, not sentence by sentence. This internal debate foreshadowed later holistic critiques by Quine that would undermine the entire positivist edifice. The verification principle had devastating implications for traditional metaphysics, ethics, and theology that shocked conventional philosophy. Statements about God, the soul, free will, and ultimate reality are unverifiable and therefore meaningless. Ethical statements like murder is wrong cannot be verified empirically because wrongness is not observable. Theological claims about transcendent beings beyond space and time admit no possible observational test. The positivists concluded these statements are pseudo-statements expressing emotions or commands, not factual content. Ayer argued that ethical statements are merely expressions of emotion with no cognitive meaning whatsoever. Saying murder is wrong is like saying boo to murder, an expression of disapproval, not a fact. This emotivist theory of ethics followed from verification. Moral properties are unobservable and moral statements unverifiable. Therefore, ethics cannot be a cognitive discipline discovering moral truths about reality's objective structure. Ethical disagreements are not about facts, but about emotions and attitudes toward behavior and situations. The positivists saw themselves as continuing the Enlightenment project of subjecting all beliefs to rational scrutiny. Metaphysics and theology survived through institutional authority and tradition, not through rational justification or evidence. By exposing metaphysical statements as meaningless, the positivists aimed to liberate thought from superstition. Science provided the only reliable method for acquiring genuine knowledge about the world and reality. Philosophy's legitimate role was clarifying scientific concepts and logical relations, not generating speculative theories. But the verification principle faced an immediate and fatal problem. It could not verify itself consistently. The statement, "A statement is meaningful only if empirically verifiable," is not itself empirically verifiable. It is not a scientific hypothesis testable through observation and experiment in any way, nor is it an analytic truth true by definition of terms according to logical analysis. By its own criterion, the verification principle is meaningless, undermining the entire positivist program self-referentially. Ayer initially responded that the verification principle is a definition of meaningful, not an empirical claim. Definitions are neither true nor false, but adopted by convention for specific purposes pragmatically. But this response weakened the principle's force. Why should metaphysicians accept this arbitrary definition? The principle became a proposal about how to use meaningful rather than a discovery about meaning. Metaphysicians could simply reject the definition and continue their traditional inquiries without logical inconsistency resulting. Carnap distinguished the language being discussed from the meta-language, discussing that language to avoid paradox. The verification principle operates at the metalinguistic level, specifying meaningfulness conditions for object-language statements below it. It is a rule for constructing languages, not a statement within any particular language itself. This technical move insulated the principle from self-application that would render it meaningless. But critics argued this merely relocated the problem without solving it fundamentally and completely. More fundamentally, the verification principle proved unable to rule out metaphysics while preserving science adequately. Any criterion liberal enough to count scientific laws as meaningful also admitted metaphysical statements as meaningful. Any criterion strict enough to exclude metaphysics also excluded essential scientific propositions and theoretical terms. Carl Hempel demonstrated this through technical arguments showing that no formulation succeeded at its stated goal. The principle either collapsed into triviality or ruled out legitimate science, along with metaphysics everywhere. Consider the statement, "The absolute is perfect." No observation could verify or falsify this metaphysical claim directly. But we could add, if the absolute is perfect, then observable event X occurs tomorrow. Now, the compound statement has observational consequences and counts as meaningful under verification criteria. Yet it smuggles in metaphysical content, precisely what the principle aimed to exclude from rational discourse. This problem infected all attempts to formulate verification precisely enough to work as intended. The positivists also struggled with the status of theoretical entities in science, like electrons and quarks. These are not directly observable, but inferred from observable effects in experimental apparatus and measurements. If meaning requires direct verification, then statements about theoretical entities are meaningless, strictly speaking. But if we allow indirect verification through observable consequences, metaphysical statements could qualify similarly through consequences. The line between legitimate theoretical science and illegitimate metaphysics became impossible to draw non-arbitrarily. Despite these failures, logical positivism permanently changed philosophy by focusing attention on meaning and verification systematically. The demand that statements have clear empirical content influenced philosophy of science and analytic philosophy broadly. Even those rejecting verification accepted that philosophical claims should connect to observable evidence somehow. The idea that many philosophical disputes are verbal rather than substantive became widely accepted wisdom. And the hostility to metaphysical speculation shaped subsequent analytic philosophy even after positivism's collapse. Part 5. The Self-Destruction of Positivism. Why the verification principle ate itself. Logical positivism collapsed spectacularly between 1950 and 1970, despite initial dominance in analytic philosophy. The movement's failure came not from external criticism alone, but from internal technical problems its practitioners identified. Carl Hempel, a leading positivist, published devastating criticisms showing verification cannot be formulated adequately at all. The principle was either too strict, excluding science, or too liberal, admitting metaphysics back in. By 1976, Ayer himself admitted that nearly all of logical positivism was false essentially. The core problem was that verifiability proved impossible to define precisely enough to do its intended work. Strong verification requiring conclusive confirmation was obviously too restrictive for any empirical science whatsoever. Universal laws cannot be verified conclusively because they cover infinitely many unobserved cases across space and time. Even particular observation statements are fallible and revisable in light of subsequent conflicting evidence, always. So the positivists moved to weak verification, allowing probable confirmation through supporting observational evidence. But weak verification created a devastating problem that Hempel formalized rigorously through careful logical analysis. Suppose metaphysical statement M is meaningless because it has no observational consequences verifiable directly. Now consider the compound statement, M or O, where O is some observation statement like it is raining now. This compound statement is verifiable. We observe whether it is raining to confirm or disconfirm it. But the compound contains the meaningless metaphysical component M as a disjunct within its structure. By the verification criterion, the compound should be meaningful because it has observational consequences and tests. But this allows meaningless metaphysical statements to become meaningful simply by disjoining them with observation statements arbitrarily. We could make any metaphysical statement meaningful through metaphysical claim or it is raining now. The criterion fails to exclude metaphysics, while this logical loophole remains exploitable by anyone. Ayer tried to fix this by requiring that each component of a compound statement be meaningful. This recursive definition seemed to solve the problem by preventing meaningless components in meaningful compounds. But Ayer's modification created new difficulties that proved even more problematic than the original formulation. Consider, not M, the negation of meaningless metaphysical statement M, independently formulated and evaluated. If M is meaningless, is not M also meaningless, or does negation somehow create meaning? If not M is meaningful, then M or not M becomes meaningful despite containing meaningless M as component. Alonzo Church proved formally that Ayer's revised criterion still fails to separate science from metaphysics adequately. Through ingenious logical constructions, Church showed that any statement could be made verifiable under Ayer's rules. Take any three statements: observation, O, metaphysical M, and auxiliary A, constructed specifically for this purpose. We can always construct relationships making M verifiable through O and A, working together systematically. The criterion thus fails its basic purpose, distinguishing meaningful scientific statements from meaningless metaphysical ones. Hempel concluded that searching for an adequate verifiability criterion is futile and should be abandoned entirely. No purely formal criterion based on logical relations to observation statements successfully separates legitimate from illegitimate discourse. The distinction between science and metaphysics is not formal, but substantive, involving actual scientific practice. Scientists judge statements by standards that cannot be captured in simple logical schemata or formal rules. Verification was meant to provide objective logical criteria, but degenerated into merely codifying scientific prejudices. The problem extended to theoretical terms in science that positivists wanted to preserve while eliminating metaphysical entities. Electrons, genes, and quarks are not directly observable but inferred from observable effects in experiments. Positivists tried to define theoretical terms through operational definitions, connecting them to measurement procedures explicitly. The electron is whatever deflects in a magnetic field in specific ways under controlled conditions. But this made theoretical terms merely shorthand for observational procedures, not names of real entities. This instrumentalist interpretation of scientific theories contradicted how scientists actually understood their own theoretical claims entirely. Scientists believe electrons really exist and have properties independent of our measurements and observations. They do not think electron merely abbreviates descriptions of meter readings and observational regularities. Positivism's verificationism forced an anti-realist interpretation of science that few scientists accepted as accurate. The doctrine that was supposed to ground science in observational rigor ended up denying scientific realism. The analytic-synthetic distinction that structured the entire positivist worldview also came under devastating attack from Quine. Positivists claimed analytic statements are true by definition, while synthetic statements depend on empirical facts. Metaphysics tries to achieve synthetic knowledge through purely analytic reasoning, which is impossible categorically. But Quine argued in two dogmas of empiricism that this distinction cannot be coherently drawn. Without it, the entire positivist edifice collapses because it cannot separate legitimate from illegitimate philosophical discourse. The positivists themselves generated internal disagreements that fragmented the movement beyond any unified doctrine or approach. Carnap's later work moved toward pragmatic framework choice, abandoning strict verification for looser confirmation standards. Neurath argued for holistic coherence rather than foundational protocol sentences providing certainty beyond question. Schlick maintained phenomenalist commitments while others moved toward physicalism about observational-based statements. These internal disputes revealed that logical positivism was not a monolithic doctrine, but diverse approaches. The historical situation also contributed to positivism's decline as the Vienna Circle dispersed under Nazi persecution. Schlick was murdered in 1936 by a deranged former student on university steps. Jewish members fled to Britain and America, scattering the intellectual community that sustained the movement. The post-war period saw naturalism and ordinary language philosophy challenge positivist assumptions fundamentally. Quine's naturalized epistemology, Kuhn's paradigms, and Wittgenstein's later philosophy offered alternatives that seemed more adequate. Ordinary language philosophers like Ryle and Austin argued that philosophical problems arise from misusing language ordinarily understood. Philosophy should clarify how we actually use words in everyday contexts, not construct ideal logical languages. The verification principle itself misunderstands how we determine meaning through use in linguistic practice. Meaning is not verification conditions, but the role an expression plays in language games systematically. This Wittgensteinian turn away from ideal language philosophy further undermined positivist assumptions about logic and meaning. The ultimate irony was that positivism's failure vindicated some metaphysical insights about knowledge and meaning deeply. The idea that we could eliminate all theory and rest purely on observation proved naive empiricism. Observation is theory-laden. What we see depends on concepts and expectations we bring to experience. The sharp distinction between observational and theoretical language cannot be drawn cleanly in actual science. These insights suggested that some metaphysical commitments are unavoidable in any knowledge claims whatsoever. Even the scientific unity positivists sought proved elusive as different sciences resisted reduction to physics completely. Biology, psychology, and social sciences use concepts not reducible to physical predicates and laws. The positivist dream of unified science with physics as foundation failed empirically as sciences developed. Emergence, holism, and levels of description became respectable rather than metaphysical confusions to eliminate. Science itself required more ontological diversity than positivists allowed in their anti-metaphysical program zealously pursued. By the 1970s, philosophers widely acknowledged that logical positivism was a failed research program permanently. Its technical problems proved insurmountable, despite decades of sophisticated efforts to reformulate verification adequately. The movement's anti-metaphysical conclusions survived in weakened form as caution about speculative philosophy generally. But the ambitious project of eliminating metaphysics through logical analysis collapsed under its own contradictions. The principle that was supposed to draw a sharp line between sense and nonsense could not itself make sense. Part 6. Quine's Two Dogmas, Demolishing the Foundation. Willard Van Orman. Quine published Two Dogmas of Empiricism in 1951, demolishing positivism's philosophical foundations utterly. The paper is sometimes considered the most important work in 20th century analytic philosophy for this reason. Quine attacked the analytic-synthetic distinction and reductionism, the two pillars supporting the positivist program entirely. Without these distinctions, verification loses its theoretical basis, and the entire framework collapses into incoherence. The essay redirected philosophy toward naturalism, holism, and pragmatism instead of logical analysis alone. The analytic-synthetic distinction claimed that some statements are true by virtue of meaning, while others depend on facts. All bachelors are unmarried is analytic. True, because bachelor means unmarried man, by definition alone. The cat is on the mat is synthetic. True, because of facts about the world. Metaphysics tries to establish synthetic truths through analytic reasoning, which is impossible by definition. This distinction organized the entire positivist worldview into logical truths, empirical facts, and meaningless metaphysical pseudo-statements. Quine argued that no clear criterion for analyticity exists that does not presuppose what it tries to define. Traditional accounts defined analytic statements as those whose denial produces logical contradictions necessarily and always. But this only pushes the question back. What makes something a logical truth versus factual truth? Kant defined analytic truths as those where the predicate is contained in the subject concept. But containment is a metaphor that provides no clear criterion for identifying analytic statements independently. Perhaps we could define analyticity through synonymy. Analytic statements remain true when synonyms are substituted throughout. Bachelor and unmarried man are synonymous, so swapping them preserves truth in analytic statements. But synonymy itself requires definition. When are two expressions synonymous in the relevant sense needed? If we say synonyms are interchangeable in all contexts preserving truth, we assume we already know truths. If we say synonyms have the same meaning, we presuppose analyticity to define meaning itself. The verification theory of meaning suggested defining synonyms as expressions with the same verification conditions always. But Quine argued that statements do not have individual verification conditions isolated from other statements. Verification is holistic. Entire theories face empirical evidence collectively, not individual sentences facing isolated tests. We cannot assign specific observations that would verify any single statement taken by itself from context. Therefore, the verification theory cannot ground synonymy or analyticity as claimed by positivist analysis. Carnap tried to define analyticity through semantic rules that linguistic frameworks stipulate explicitly and conventionally. A framework's semantic rules declare which sentences are analytic within that framework by stipulation. But Quine objected that this just labels certain sentences analytic without explaining what analyticity means. Semantic rules presuppose we understand what it means for a sentence to be true by meaning alone. Without independent understanding of analyticity, semantic rules merely redistribute the obscurity rather than eliminating it. Quine's most powerful argument was that the analytic-synthetic distinction collapses under the holistic character of confirmation. When experience conflicts with our expectations, we must revise some beliefs somewhere in our system. But no statement is immune to revision in principle when evidence seems sufficiently compelling. Even logical laws, like the law of excluded middle, have been questioned in quantum mechanics contexts. Any statement can be held true despite contrary evidence if we make drastic adjustments elsewhere sufficiently. This revealed that the difference between analytic and synthetic statements is pragmatic, not absolute and principled. Some statements are more central to our conceptual scheme and harder to revise without massive disruption. Logical laws and definitions are central, particular observational claims are peripheral and easily revised. But this is a matter of degree reflecting pragmatic considerations, not a sharp metaphysical distinction. The entire web of belief faces the tribunal of experience collectively as an interconnected system. Quine's web of belief metaphor captured this holistic picture of knowledge structure and empirical testing comprehensively. Beliefs form an interconnected network where changing one belief affects many others through logical implications radiating outward. Observational beliefs are at the periphery, directly connected to sensory experience and easily modified. Logical laws and definitions are at the center, maximally connected to other beliefs throughout. But all beliefs are revisable in principle. Centrality just means revision would require more extensive changes. This holism undermined the reductionist thesis that individual statements have specific empirical content that verifies them. Positivists claimed each meaningful statement reduces to statements about immediate sense experience through logical analysis. But if statements face experience collectively, they lack individual empirical content independent of surrounding theory. The observational implications of a hypothesis depend on auxiliary assumptions, background theory, and interpretation conventions. We cannot isolate the empirical meaning of any single statement from its theoretical context entirely. Quine famously concluded that the two dogmas of empiricism are at root identical in their mistaken assumption. Both assume that individual statements have determinate content analyzable into linguistic and factual components separately. The analytic-synthetic distinction tries to separate statements true by meaning from statements true by fact. Reductionism tries to specify each statement's empirical content through translating it into observational terms. Both presuppose that meaning and content attach to individual statements in isolation from context. Quine proposed naturalized epistemology as the alternative to traditional foundationalist programs and logical analysis approaches. Instead of seeking a priori foundations for knowledge, we should study how we actually acquire beliefs. Psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science investigate how sensory stimulation produces theoretical beliefs about the world. Philosophy becomes continuous with empirical science, studying human cognition, not a prior tribunal legislating science. This naturalistic turn abandoned metaphysics not through verification, but through making philosophy empirical and scientific. The pragmatic dimension of Quine's thought emerged in his principle of ontological relativity and indeterminacy theses. We choose which ontology to accept based on the simplicity and predictive success of theories using it. Different ontologies might serve equally well for organizing experience and predicting observations accurately. There is no fact of the matter about which ontology corresponds to ultimate reality independent of theories. Metaphysical disputes about what really exists often reflect framework choices rather than factual disagreements. Quine's critique extended to modal logic and intentional contexts that resisted his extensional approach completely. Necessity and possibility seemed to require meanings and properties beyond mere reference and extension. Quine argued these notions are scientifically disreputable, introducing obscure metaphysical commitments beyond observation. Science can proceed using only extensional logic and ontology of physical objects and sets. Modal metaphysics was another speculative addition to be eliminated through naturalistic scientific philosophy rigorously pursued. The impact of two dogmas transformed analytic philosophy by removing its positivist foundations permanently and thoroughly. If analyticity is illusory, then the positivist program of eliminating metaphysics through verification collapses entirely. But Quine did not rehabilitate traditional metaphysics. He naturalized and pragmatized it instead fundamentally. Ontology becomes a pragmatic choice within scientific theorizing, not a priori metaphysical speculation about ultimate reality. Philosophy studies how science works, not what exists independent of scientific inquiry and knowledge. Quine's holism influenced philosophy of science through Duhem-Quine thesis about underdetermination of theory by evidence. Since theories face experience collectively, evidence never conclusively proves or refutes any particular hypothesis definitively. We can always protect a hypothesis by revising auxiliary assumptions, definitions, or observational interpretations. Theory choice depends on pragmatic virtues like simplicity, unification, and fruitfulness beyond pure empirical adequacy. This made room for conventionalism and relativism that positivists had tried to eliminate through verification. Critics argued that Quine overstated his case and that some analytic synthetic distinction survives his critique successfully. Perhaps the distinction is not perfectly sharp, but still useful for marking degrees of centrality. Some statements seem more definitional and less revisable than others in actual scientific and linguistic practice. Quine's own philosophical claims employ conceptual analysis that seems to presuppose some meaning-fact distinction. Grice and Strawson defended a dogma of empiricism against Quine's attack on traditional distinctions. But Quine's fundamental points about holism and naturalism permanently altered how philosophers understood meaning and verification. Meanings are not atomic properties of individual sentences, but emerge from roles in linguistic and theoretical systems. Verification is not sentence-by-sentence confirmation, but theory acceptance based on overall empirical adequacy and pragmatic virtues. These insights made the positivist program of eliminating metaphysics through verification untenable going forward. Philosophy required new approaches that accepted holism, naturalism, and the continuity of philosophy with science. Part 7. Later, Wittgenstein, language games, and the end of essence. Wittgenstein repudiated his own Tractatus and developed a radically different philosophy in the 1940s and 50s. The Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously in 1953, rejected the picture theory and logical atomism entirely. The later Wittgenstein argued that meaning is used in language games, not correspondence to reality. Philosophical problems dissolve when we examine how language actually functions in diverse practical contexts. This therapeutic approach aimed to show metaphysics arises from misunderstanding language's ordinary operation systematically. The early Wittgenstein sought the essence of language, the underlying logical structure all meaningful language must share. The picture theory claimed all propositions function by representing states of affairs in logical space. But examining actual language reveals extraordinary diversity of uses with no common essence unifying them. Commands, questions, exclamations, promises, descriptions, and jokes all use language, but picture nothing at all. Trying to find the essence of language is like trying to find what all games have in common. Wittgenstein introduced the concept of family resemblance to explain how concepts work without essential definitions necessarily. Games share overlapping similarities. Some involve competition, some chance, some skill, some teams, some boards. But no single feature is common to all games as the essential property making something a game. The term game has meaning through a network of resemblances, not through naming an essence. Similarly, language games share family resemblances but have no common essence underlying all linguistic practices. A language game is a complete system of linguistic and non-linguistic activities forming a practice together. Giving orders and obeying them, describing objects, reporting events, making jokes, asking questions, all are distinct games. Each game has its own rules, determining what moves are correct within that practice specifically. Meaning is determined by role in the language game, not by picturing or verification conditions. To understand a word's meaning is to understand its use across the relevant language games. This approach dissolved many traditional philosophical problems by showing they rest on linguistic misunderstandings and confusions. Philosophers ask questions like, what is the essence of knowledge? Or what is time really? These seem like deep questions requiring metaphysical investigation of ultimate reality beyond ordinary understanding. But Wittgenstein argued they arise from treating words as naming essences when they actually function differently. The proper response is not to answer, but to show the question rests on confused grammatical assumptions. The example of following a rule illustrated Wittgenstein's later method and its implications for metaphysics thoroughly. Understanding a rule seems to involve grasping something mental that guides correct application to new cases. But any mental state or formula can be interpreted multiple ways incompatibly with each other. What makes one interpretation correct and others incorrect cannot be another mental act of interpretation. Rule following is a practice embedded in training, correction, and shared forms of life. This showed that meaning cannot be private mental states or essences, but must be publicly accessible practices. The private language argument demonstrated that a language referring only to private sensations is impossible. Language requires public criteria for correct use that others can apply to check and correct mistakes. Private sensations can play no role in determining meaning because no one else can access them. This eliminated the Cartesian picture of mind as private inner realm with privileged first-person access. The illusion of depth in philosophical problems comes from misunderstanding our grammatical forms and their ordinary employment. We ask what time really is because we treat time as naming an object whose nature requires investigation. But time functions grammatically in diverse ways, measuring duration, locating events, expressing sequence and causation. The word does not name a mysterious entity, but operates within various temporal language games. The philosophical problem dissolves when we remind ourselves how we actually use temporal vocabulary in practice. Wittgenstein likened philosophy to therapy that cures intellectual diseases by revealing their linguistic sources systematically. Philosophical problems are not genuine problems requiring solutions, but confusions requiring dissolution through clarification. The philosopher assembles reminders about how we actually use words to break the spell of misleading grammatical analogies. Once we see clearly how language functions, the problems vanish like illusions exposed by light. Philosophy leaves everything as it is, merely arranging what was always there for clear view. This had devastating implications for metaphysics as traditionally conceived seeking essences and ultimate reality beyond appearances. Metaphysical questions like what is existence or what is substance arise from grammatical confusions fundamentally. Existence is not a property objects have. It is presupposed in talking about any object whatsoever. Substance is not a mysterious substrate, but a grammatical notion organizing our talk about persisting objects. These are not discoveries about reality, but clarifications of how we use certain concepts normally. The idea of forms of life-grounded language games in shared practices and natural human capacities broadly. Language games rest on agreement in judgments and reactions that constitute our form of life together. This agreement is not based on opinions, but on instinctive reactions trained through social interaction. We share a form of life as biological and social beings with common needs and capacities. Language emerges from and serves this shared practical life, not from representing independent reality. Wittgenstein's Quietism rejected constructive philosophical theories in favor of purely therapeutic clarification without theories. He wrote that real discovery in philosophy consists in seeing problems as misunderstandings rather than unsolved questions. The goal is to show the fly the way out of the bottle, to dissolve confusions trapping thought. Offering philosophical theories just creates new flies and new bottles requiring further dissolution later. Philosophy should simply describe language use without explaining, theorizing, or constructing anything at all. This approach seemed to eliminate philosophy's traditional ambitions entirely in favor of linguistic anthropology and description. If philosophy only clarifies how we use words, what distinguishes it from descriptive linguistics or anthropology? Wittgenstein's response was that philosophy addresses particular confusions, not general empirical facts about language. It is occasioned by specific tangles of thought that language games reveal when examined carefully. But this made philosophy's domain limited and negative, removing confusions rather than discovering truths. Critics argued that Wittgenstein's own philosophy presupposes substantive views about meaning, mind, and social practice unavoidably. The claim that meaning is use seems like a philosophical theory, not mere description of grammar. The private language argument makes claims about necessary conditions for meaning that seem metaphysical. Wittgenstein appeared to be doing precisely the kind of theorizing he officially rejected throughout his work. His therapeutic method smuggled in substantial philosophical commitments while denying their theoretical character explicitly. Nevertheless, Wittgenstein's later philosophy transformed how analytic philosophers understood their discipline's methods and proper aims. The idea that philosophical problems arise from linguistic confusion became widely accepted despite disagreements about solutions. Ordinary language philosophy flourished in Oxford, with Austin, Ryle and Strawson applying Wittgensteinian methods to traditional problems. Even those rejecting Wittgenstein's conclusions absorbed his emphasis on careful attention to actual linguistic practice. Philosophy, after Wittgenstein, could no longer ignore how language actually functions in favor of logical idealization alone. The legacy for metaphysics was deeply ambiguous between dissolution and transformation rather than simple continuation unchanged. Wittgenstein seemed to eliminate metaphysics by showing its questions rest on grammatical confusions entirely. But some philosophers used his methods to do metaphysics differently, investigating our conceptual schemes rather than reality. Descriptive metaphysics examined the structure of our thought and talk about the world systematically. This preserved some metaphysical inquiry while abandoning claims to discover ultimate reality beyond language. Part 8. Carnap's Frameworks, Ontology as Language Choice. Rudolf Carnap developed the most sophisticated response to ontological questions within the positivist and post-positivist tradition overall. His paper, Empiricism, Semantics and Ontology, in 1950 distinguished internal from external questions about existence fundamentally. Internal questions occur within a linguistic framework. Is there a prime number between 5 and 10? External questions ask whether the framework itself corresponds to reality. Do numbers really exist objectively? Carnap argued that external questions are pseudo-questions that only framework choices can address pragmatically. A linguistic framework consists of rules specifying which expressions are meaningful and which inferences are valid within it. The framework of physical objects includes rules for identifying, counting, and reasoning about material things spatio-temporally located. The framework of numbers includes arithmetical operations and logical relations between numerical expressions systematically. The framework of properties and relations includes predication rules and logical combinatorics of attributes. Each framework enables discourse about certain kinds of entities through its constitutive rules together. Internal questions are settled by applying the framework's rules to determine what follows from definitions and stipulations. Is there a prime number between 5 and 10? Yes, the number 7 meets the definition. This question has a definite answer within the number framework's rules and definitions explicitly. Is the Eiffel Tower in Paris? Yes, according to geographical facts and the physical object framework. Internal questions are either analytic, following from definitions, or empirical, requiring observational evidence within the framework. External questions ask whether entities the framework posits really exist independently of any framework adoption or choice. Do numbers really exist as abstract objects, or are they mere linguistic constructions without mind-independent reality? Do physical objects really exist, or are there only sense data that we mistakenly reify? These seem like deep metaphysical questions about the ultimate furniture of reality itself. But Carnap argued they are actually practical questions about which framework to adopt pragmatically. The choice between frameworks is not a question of truth, but of practical utility for various purposes. We adopt the physical object framework because it organizes experience efficiently and enables successful prediction and control. We adopt the number framework because it facilitates mathematical reasoning and scientific theorizing systematically. These are pragmatic choices based on simplicity, fruitfulness, and compatibility with other accepted frameworks. There is no framework-independent standpoint from which to judge whether frameworks correspond to reality correctly. This approach dissolved traditional metaphysical disputes as confusions between internal and external questions throughout philosophy's history. Realists and nominalists about universals seemed to disagree about whether properties exist beyond particular instances. But Carnap showed they might simply prefer different frameworks with no factual disagreement at all. One chooses a framework with property variables. The other uses only particular variables and predicates. Each framework might serve its users adequately for their purposes without being objectively correct. Carnap's principle of tolerance underlay this pluralistic approach to ontology and logical frameworks generally and comprehensively. There are no absolute logical laws or ontological categories that all frameworks must obey necessarily. We are free to construct any consistent framework that serves our theoretical and practical needs. Different logics, ontologies, and mathematical systems are all legitimate if they function coherently internally. The idea that there is one true logic or one correct ontology is an illegitimate metaphysical dogma. This tolerant pluralism seemed to eliminate metaphysics by making ontology a matter of pragmatic framework choice only. Traditional metaphysicians claim to discover which entities really exist through rational argument and systematic reasoning. Carnap showed that existence claims only make sense relative to frameworks we adopt for practical reasons. There is no absolute sense in which numbers or properties or physical objects simply exist. Ontology becomes a pragmatic engineering problem, not a theoretical discovery about reality's ultimate structure. But this raised the question of what determines framework choice, if not correspondence to reality itself, ultimately. Carnap listed pragmatic criteria: simplicity, fruitfulness, compatibility, explanatory power, and successful prediction facilitation constantly. But these are vague and often conflict when comparing different frameworks on various dimensions. How do we weigh simplicity against explanatory power when they point to different frameworks? Without some notion of truth or correspondence, framework choice seems arbitrary or merely conventional ultimately. Quine famously objected that Carnap cannot maintain a double standard for ontological and empirical questions simultaneously. Both involve choosing theories or frameworks based on pragmatic virtues and empirical adequacy combined together. Scientific hypothesis, choice, and framework choice differ only in degree of generality and centrality. There is no principal distinction between changing a theory and changing a framework fundamentally. Both are pragmatic adjustments to our overall system of beliefs facing the tribunal of experience together. This critique showed that Carnap's distinction between internal and external questions presupposes the analytic-synthetic distinction fundamentally. Internal questions are analytic or empirical within the framework's rules that define terms meaningfully. External questions are neither because they ask about the framework itself from outside, but if the analytic-synthetic distinction collapses, so does the internal-external question distinction with it. Framework choice becomes continuous with ordinary empirical hypothesis testing rather than separate pragmatic meta-level choice. Nevertheless, Carnap's work influenced how philosophers understood ontological commitment and the nature of existence claims thoroughly. Quine himself adopted the idea that our ontology is determined by our best total theory. We are committed to whatever entities our scientific theories quantify over in their canonical formulations. Ontology is read off from our theories, not discovered independently through metaphysical reasoning about reality. This was a more naturalized version of Carnap's framework approach, without the sharp internal-external distinction. The deflationary approach to metaphysics that Carnap pioneered became influential across analytic philosophy generally and widely. Instead of seeking deep metaphysical truths about ultimate reality, philosophers examined our conceptual schemes and frameworks. Metaphysics transformed from first philosophy providing foundations to descriptive mapping of our conceptual commitments systematically. This preserved something called metaphysics, while abandoning traditional ambitions to transcend human perspectives and frameworks. Ontology became internalized to theoretical choice, rather than being about reality, independent of any theories. Critics argued this deflated metaphysics too much, eliminating its legitimate questions about what actually exists mind-independently. Surely there are facts about what exists that do not reduce to framework choices we adopt pragmatically. Electrons either exist or they do not, regardless of whether we find it convenient to quantify over them. Carnap seemed to confuse epistemology with ontology, how we know with what actually is. The pragmatic character of framework adoption does not show that reality itself is framework relative at all. Carnap's legacy was the recognition that many metaphysical disputes involve talking past each other using different frameworks. Clarifying what framework participants presuppose can dissolve apparent disagreements about existence or fundamental categories completely. This therapeutic function preserved some role for philosophy in untangling conceptual confusions about ontology. But it also suggested that substantive metaphysical inquiry into reality's mind-independent structure is impossible or meaningless. Philosophy can analyze our frameworks, but cannot discover which framework correctly represents ultimate reality transcending frameworks. Part 9. Nietzsche and Continental Critique. Metaphysics as Psychology. Friedrich Nietzsche attacked metaphysics from a completely different direction than analytic philosophers, exposing its psychological origins. He argued that metaphysical systems are not rational discoveries, but expressions of their creators' instincts and values. The will to truth that drives metaphysics is itself a value requiring genealogical investigation. Metaphysicians claim to seek objective reality, but actually impose their moral prejudices on the world. Understanding metaphysics requires psychology and history, not logical analysis or empirical verification alone. Nietzsche's genealogical method traced concepts back to their origins in human needs and power relations systematically. Metaphysical concepts like substance, causation, being, and truth emerged from practical requirements for survival and control. We invented stable substances because we needed to identify recurring objects in our environment reliably. We created the concept of causation to predict and manipulate events for our benefit. These were useful fictions that we forgot were our own creations, treating them as discoveries instead. The distinction between true world and apparent world formed metaphysics' core structure across all Western philosophy historically. Plato posited eternal forms as the true reality behind changing sensory appearances we ordinarily experience. Christianity located ultimate reality in an afterlife beyond the temporal suffering of earthly existence. Kant distinguished noumena as things in themselves from phenomena as mere appearances to human cognition. All these dualisms denigrated actual experienced reality in favour of an imagined transcendent realm beyond. Nietzsche diagnosed this pattern as nihilism, the devaluation of life and this world for imaginary alternatives. Why did philosophers consistently prefer the transcendent to the immanent, the eternal to the temporal, the unchanging to becoming? He argued this reveals resentment against life's contingency, suffering, and lack of ultimate justification or meaning. Metaphysicians cannot accept reality as purposeless flux without inherent value or teleological direction toward goodness. So they invent a better world elsewhere and declare it the true reality while dismissing actual existence. The will to truth itself became an object of Nietzsche's critical suspicion, requiring explanation psychologically. Why do we value truth over useful fictions, accuracy over creative interpretation, knowledge over ignorance? Nietzsche suggested that the will to truth is actually will to power taking a particular ascetic form. We seek truth to control nature, predict outcomes, and establish authority over others through knowledge. But truth-seeking also expresses life denial when it rejects all perspectives as false except one alleged objective view. Positivism replaced metaphysical objectivity in Nietzsche's positive account of knowledge and interpretation systematically throughout. All knowledge originates from particular perspectives with specific interests and limitations built into them necessarily. There is no view from nowhere, no perspective-free access to reality as it is in itself. Every interpretation reflects the interpreter's drives, values, and position in life's power struggles. This does not mean all perspectives are equally valid, but that none achieves absolute metaphysical objectivity. Truth became a kind of error without which certain species cannot live, according to Nietzsche's provocative formulation. We need stable categories, causal regularities, and logical consistency to navigate the world successfully as organisms. But these are simplifications imposed on chaotic flux of becoming that constitutes actual reality beneath concepts. The belief that objects persist identically through time is useful but false when examined carefully. Truth is whatever enhances life and power. Falsity is whatever diminishes them in practice. Metaphysical concepts arose from language's grammatical structure, misleading us about reality's actual nature fundamentally. Subject-predicate grammar suggests substances possessing properties. The table is brown. The soul thinks thoughts clearly. But this grammatical form is our own creation, not a discovery about reality's fundamental structure. We reify grammatical subjects into metaphysical substances and grammatical predicates into properties or attributes. Language creates metaphysics by projecting its structure onto the world we then claim to discover. The concept of being itself emerged from linguistic needs and hardened into metaphysical dogma over centuries. Being is not a feature of reality, but a grammatical requirement. We must say something is something. Parmenides elevated this linguistic necessity into a metaphysical principle that being is one, unchanging, and eternal. This confusion of grammar with reality infected all subsequent Western philosophy through Plato, Aristotle, and beyond. Metaphysics is frozen grammar mistaken for insight into reality transcending language and conceptual schemes. Nietzsche argued that the ascetic ideal drove metaphysics' devaluation of this world for transcendent alternatives systematically. Asceticism denies bodily existence, sensory experience, and temporal becoming in favor of spiritual unchanging reality. This ideal expresses life turned against itself, sick with existence and seeking escape into fantasy. Metaphysicians are ascetic priests who promise redemption from life through access to absolute truth beyond. Their systems rationalize and intellectualize the basic ascetic hostility toward embodied, finite existence in time. The death of God proclaimed by Nietzsche meant the collapse of all metaphysical guarantees and transcendent foundations. God was the ultimate metaphysical entity guaranteeing truth, morality, and meaning from beyond the natural world. With God dead, nothing underwrites metaphysical distinctions between appearance and reality, becoming and being, temporal and eternal. We are left with only this world, this life, without transcendent justification or ultimate purpose. Metaphysics cannot survive this recognition that we have murdered its foundation through our own intellectual honesty. Nietzsche advocated revaluation of all values to overcome metaphysics and its life-denying nihilism comprehensively and thoroughly. Instead of seeking truth, we should ask what interpretations enhance life, power, and creative flourishing. Instead of permanent being, we should affirm becoming, change, and perspectival interpretation without foundations. Instead of transcendent reality, we should embrace this world as the only reality worth valuing. The overman creates values rather than discovering them in metaphysical reality beyond human creation. This critique influenced Continental philosophy's relationship to metaphysics throughout the 20th century and beyond entirely. Heidegger, though critical of Nietzsche, adopted his historical approach to metaphysics as tradition requiring destruction. Foucault extended genealogy to examine how power relations shape what counts as knowledge and truth. Derrida deconstructed metaphysical oppositions, showing how they depend on excluded or subordinated terms logically. All these approaches treated metaphysics as historical phenomenon to be understood rather than timeless truth. Critics argued that Nietzsche's own position relies on metaphysical commitments he officially rejects throughout his works. His concept of will to power seems like a metaphysical principle about reality's fundamental nature and structure. Perspectivism claims all knowledge is perspectival, but is this claim itself perspectival, or does it transcend perspectives? If perspectival, it undermines itself. If not, it contradicts itself by claiming non-perspectival knowledge. Nietzsche appeared to offer metaphysics of becoming against metaphysics of being, not genuine overcoming of metaphysics. The therapeutic dimension of Nietzsche's critique paralleled Wittgenstein despite vast differences in method and vocabulary. Both sought to free thinking from metaphysical confusion by revealing its sources in language and psychology. Both rejected systematic philosophy in favor of perspicuous representation, exposing hidden assumptions and motivations. Both saw philosophy's task as dissolution of problems rather than construction of better theories. The divergence was Nietzsche's emphasis on power and values versus Wittgenstein's focus on logic and grammar. Nietzsche's legacy made metaphysics appear as historically contingent expression of cultural values rather than eternal truth. This historicization undermined metaphysics' authority by showing its claims reflect particular times and places, not reality. Different cultures develop different metaphysical frameworks based on their needs, values, and power structures. No framework achieves privileged access to reality independent of human interests, shaping inquiry from the start. Metaphysics becomes anthropology, the study of how humans have thought, not discovery of how reality is. Part 10. Heidegger's Destruction, Being and the End of Western Metaphysics. Martin Heidegger declared that Western metaphysics reached its completion and exhaustion in the 20th century necessarily. His project involved destruction of the metaphysical tradition to recover the question of being itself forgotten throughout history. Traditional metaphysics studied beings, particular entities and their properties, but ignored being, the condition enabling beings to be. This forgetting of being constituted metaphysics' fundamental error, infecting all Western philosophy from Plato forward. Only by overcoming metaphysics could thinking return to its proper task, the question of being. Being and Time. In 1927 began this destruction through analyzing human existence as Dasein, being there. Dasein is the entity for whom being is itself a question and concern in its very existence. Unlike objects simply present at hand, Dasein exists by projecting possibilities and understanding its own being temporally. Heidegger analyzed Dasein structures to reveal how being shows itself through temporal human existence fundamentally. But the project failed because it remained trapped within metaphysics' focus on beings rather than being. Metaphysics always approached being through beings, asking what makes beings be, or what all beings share. Plato answered with eternal forms that beings participate in to possess definite characteristics and identities. Aristotle identified substance as the primary being underlying all changes and properties accidental to it. Medieval thinkers posited God as the supreme being, causing and sustaining all other beings. Each approach took some being or type of being as the ground explaining being generally. This onto-theological constitution of metaphysics made it unable to think being as such without reducing it. Metaphysics interprets being as presence, what is fully present, enduringly actual, completely determinate and fixed. This privileging of presence over absence, permanence over change, actuality over possibility, infected all metaphysical thinking. Being got conflated with beings that are maximally present, eternal forms, unchanging substances, necessary God. The question of what it means for anything to be at all got covered over completely. Heidegger traced this forgetting back to the pre-Socratics, where the question of being first arose, then disappeared. Parmenides and Heraclitus thought being but did not thematize the difference between being and beings explicitly. Plato established the interpretation of being as presence and permanence that dominated Western thought afterward. Aristotle systematized this into the science of being qua being, making metaphysics a theoretical discipline. From then on, philosophy forgot that being is not itself a being requiring metaphysical explanation. The history of metaphysics unfolded as progressive forgetting of being through increasing focus on beings alone. Medieval metaphysics made God the highest being and ultimate cause of all other beings existing. Modern metaphysics, from Descartes forward, made the subject and its representations central to being's interpretation. Nietzsche's will to power and eternal return represented metaphysics' culmination in subjectivism and value positing completely. Each stage moved further from the original question while claiming to answer it definitively. Technology represented the final form of metaphysics, where being appears only as standing reserve for human use. The technological worldview treats all beings, including nature and humans, as resources to be ordered and exploited. Nothing has intrinsic worth or meaning beyond its utility for technological systems maximizing efficiency. Being itself becomes indistinguishable from beings insofar as they serve technological ends and purposes. This completes metaphysics by reducing everything to calculable presence available for manipulation and control totally. Heidegger argued that overcoming metaphysics requires a step back from beings to the clearing where being happens. Being is not a being, not a property, not a ground or cause explicable through beings. It is the opening, the lighting, the event through which beings come to presence and withdraw. Thinking. Being requires letting go of representational metaphysical thinking that objectifies everything before consciousness. This involves a completely different relationship to language, truth, and human existence than metaphysics allows. Language became central to Heidegger's later thought as the house of being where truth happens primordially. Language is not a tool humans use to represent beings, but the site where being addresses humanity. Poetic language preserves this original revealing better than metaphysical prose that calculates and controls. We do not speak language. Language speaks us by opening the world wherein beings can appear. Thinking must listen to beings' address in language rather than imposing concepts onto beings. Truth shifted from correctness of representations to aletheia, unconcealment, the happening of disclosure itself fundamentally. Metaphysics understood truth as correspondence between thought and beings, adequation of intellect to thing. But this presupposes that beings are already unconcealed, already in the clearing of being. Truth more originally means this unconcealment through which beings show themselves as they are. Metaphysics forgot this primordial truth by focusing only on correct statements about already disclosed beings. The destining of being sent Western history through various epochs of being's self-disclosure and withdrawal. Greek antiquity experienced being as physis, emerging presence and self-showing of beings in nature. Medieval Christianity knew being as created by God and dependent on divine sustaining power. Modernity interprets being as representation before a subject who grounds certainty through consciousness. Technology reveals being as standing reserve, ordered for human use and technological efficiency. Heidegger's obscurity and neologisms made his work notoriously difficult, inviting charges of mysticism and nonsense. Critics argued that the being question has no clear content and generates pseudo-problems through linguistic confusion. Carnap famously analysed Heidegger's statement, "Nothing nothings," as violating logical syntax and meaning nothing. If being is not a being, what are we talking about when we ask about being itself? The entire project seemed like metaphysics at its worst. Empty speculation about unverifiable transcendent realities. Heidegger's involvement with Nazism tainted his philosophy's reception and complicated assessment of his thought's value permanently. He joined the Nazi Party and served briefly as university rector, implementing Nazi educational reforms enthusiastically. Though he later distanced himself, the extent to which his philosophy enabled or implied fascism remains debated. Some argue his critique of technology and modernity aligned with reactionary anti-Enlightenment politics intrinsically. Others claim his philosophy is separable from his political mistakes and misjudgments during that period. Nevertheless, Heidegger influenced Continental philosophy profoundly by making metaphysics a historical problem requiring destruction comprehensively. Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and French phenomenology absorbed his existential analytics of human being and temporality. Gadamer developed hermeneutics from Heidegger's focus on understanding and historical situatedness of interpretation. Derrida radicalized destruction into deconstruction of metaphysical oppositions underlying Western thought systematically. All these movements treated metaphysics as tradition to be overcome rather than eternal truth. The question whether Heidegger overcame metaphysics or remained within it differently persists among interpreters today. His talk of being seems metaphysical, even if he denies being is a being or ground. The destining of being, epochs of being's disclosure, and being's withdrawal all sound like metaphysical claims. Heidegger appeared to offer a different metaphysics rather than genuine overcoming of metaphysical thinking entirely. His followers divide between those seeking non-metaphysical thinking and those developing new phenomenological metaphysics from Heidegger. The legacy was making metaphysics appear as Western tradition's fate rather than universal rational necessity for thought. Other cultures developed different ways of thinking that did not privilege presence, substance, or eternal being. The question of being might be culturally specific to Greek origins of Western philosophy exclusively. This relativized metaphysics historically and opened philosophy to alternative traditions and thought paths beyond metaphysics. Whether this truly overcomes metaphysics or merely replaces it with Heideggerian metaphysics remains contested ground. Part 11. The Pragmatist Dissolution, when metaphysics makes no difference. American pragmatism attacked metaphysics by insisting that ideas have meaning only through practical consequences they produce. Charles Sanders. Peirce formulated the pragmatic maxim. Consider what effects objects have that might have practical bearing. Our conception of these effects constitutes our complete conception of the object itself entirely. If two apparently different theories have identical practical consequences, they express the same idea, despite verbal differences. Metaphysical disputes that make no practical difference are empty verbal disagreements without cognitive content. William James popularized pragmatism as a method for settling metaphysical disputes by examining their cash value. He asked what difference it makes in practice whether matter or mind is ultimate substance. If no observable consequences distinguish these views, the dispute is idle and meaningless philosophically. Truth is what works in practice, what satisfies our intellectual and practical needs successfully. Metaphysical theories should be evaluated by their fruits, not by correspondence to unknowable reality itself. This instrumental approach made truth a species of value rather than a relation of correspondence to facts. True beliefs are those that prove useful for guiding action, solving problems, and organizing experience coherently. There is no additional property of accurately representing reality independent of all practical considerations. Truth happens to an idea through verification, through being confirmed in experience and successful in application. We make ideas true by validating them through satisfactory working in practice over time. The pragmatic method dissolved many traditional metaphysical problems as pseudo-problems lacking practical significance entirely. Does matter cause mind, or does mind cause matter in the fundamental order of reality? Pragmatism asked whether anything observable distinguishes these metaphysical pictures in actual experience consistently. If both theories explain the same phenomena equally well, the difference is verbal rather than substantive. Philosophy should abandon such disputes to focus on genuine problems with practical consequences for inquiry. Peirce argued that reality is what the community of inquirers will agree upon in the ideal long run. Truth is not static correspondence, but the fated opinion that investigation would reach if pursued far enough. The real is what this final opinion represents, not some mind-independent substrate beneath all possible inquiry. This made metaphysical questions about reality, independent of inquiry, incoherent from the start fundamentally. We cannot ask what reality is apart from what inquiry discloses, because reality just is the limit. John Dewey naturalized metaphysics as empirical study of experience's generic traits, rather than transcendent speculation. He rejected the quest for certainty and fixed foundations that motivated traditional metaphysical systems throughout history. Philosophy should examine how inquiry actually proceeds to solve problems in changing circumstances adaptively. Metaphysics becomes descriptive analysis of experience's stable features that make inquiry possible at all. But it cannot justify itself a priori or claim access to reality beyond possible human experience. Dewey's instrumentalism treated ideas as tools for reorganizing experience rather than representations of independent reality. Concepts, theories, and beliefs are instruments we construct to address problems arising in inquiry and action. They are evaluated by their effectiveness in resolving problematic situations, not by correspondence to facts. The fact-value distinction dissolved because all knowledge involves normative standards of successful problem-solving practically. Science is continuous with everyday problem-solving, using more systematic methods to address more complex problems. This approach eliminated the traditional metaphysical picture of knowledge as static grasp of eternal truths unchangingly. Knowledge is experimental and fallible, always revisable in light of new experience and problems encountered. There are no incorrigible foundations or necessary first principles immune to revision in ongoing inquiry. Even logic and mathematics are tools that might require modification if they prove inadequate practically. Metaphysics, seeking absolute certainty about ultimate reality, mistakes knowledge's provisional character for its essence. The pragmatists rejected substance metaphysics in favour of events, processes and relations as fundamental reality categories. Substances seemed like static entities underlying change, but experience shows only changing processes and interactions. Relations are as real as their relator, perhaps more fundamental than things related together. Reality consists of temporal becoming rather than timeless being, of doing rather than static existing. This process metaphysics aligned with Darwinian evolution and emerging scientific worldview generally and thoroughly. James's radical empiricism insisted that relations are directly experienced, not inferred from discrete atomic sensations. We experience the and, the but, the transition from one state to another in immediate experience itself. British empiricism had treated relations as mental additions to isolated sense impressions given separately, but actual experience is of connected wholes, where relations are as directly given as qualities. This undercut the problem of how mind connects separate impressions by showing connection is primordially given. The pragmatists dissolved the mind-body problem by rejecting the dualistic assumptions generating it in traditional metaphysics. Mind is not a separate substance, but a function of living organisms, adapting to environments successfully. Consciousness is not a container of representations, but the adjustment process itself in problematic situations. There is no metaphysical gulf between mental and physical requiring bridging through causal interaction theories. The problem dissolves when we see mind as functional aspect of natural biological organisms. Pragmatism's emphasis on practice and consequences resonated with Wittgenstein's language games, despite independent origins. Both rejected the idea that meaning consists in representing independent reality through correspondence relations. Both emphasized that understanding comes through seeing how expressions function in practical contexts. Both dissolved philosophical problems by showing they rest on divorcing thought from its practical employment. The Convergence suggested that practice-centered approaches transcend analytic continental divisions in philosophy. Critics charge that pragmatism collapsed truth into mere utility, losing objectivity and risking relativism completely. If truth is what works, then different communities might have incompatible truths if different beliefs work for them. This seemed to abandon the idea that reality constrains belief independently of what we find useful. Pragmatism appeared to make truth subjective or conventional rather than objective and mind-independent. The cash value criterion seemed too permissive, counting as meaningful many claims pragmatists wanted to reject. Pragmatists responded that workability is constrained by reality, even if we access reality only through experience. Beliefs that work must engage reality successfully. Merely satisfying us psychologically is not enough for truth. Long-run inquiry converges because reality resists certain interpretations while accommodating others consistently. The constraint is pragmatic rather than metaphysical. Reality is what makes inquiry succeeds or fails. This preserved objectivity without requiring correspondence to unknowable things in themselves beyond all possible inquiry entirely. The influence of pragmatism surged in late 20th century through Quine's naturalism and Rorty's neo-pragmatism explicitly. Quine absorbed Pearson themes of community agreement and holistic theory confirmation in his epistemology thoroughly. Rorty radicalized James's instrumentalism, arguing that truth is what our peers will let us get away with saying. This provoked accusations of relativism, but also forced rethinking of philosophy's relationship to truth and objectivity. Pragmatism offered an alternative to both traditional metaphysics and positivist anti-metaphysics through focusing on practice. Part 12. Science against Metaphysics. How Physics and Neuroscience Killed Dualism. Modern science systematically eliminated metaphysical posits by explaining phenomena without invoking souls, substances, or transcendent causes. Physics demonstrated that material processes follow discoverable laws without requiring immaterial forces directing them purposefully. Neuroscience showed that consciousness arises from brain activity rather than from an independent mental substance. Biology explained life through chemistry and evolution, not through vital forces or teleological principles. Each scientific advance reduced metaphysics' explanatory territory until little remained for metaphysical speculation beyond science. Cartesian dualism posited mind and body as fundamentally different substances, thinking stuff versus extended stuff entirely. Mind was characterized by consciousness and intentionality, body by spatial extension and mechanical causation alone. This created the notorious interaction problem. How can immaterial mind causally affect material body? Descartes proposed the pineal gland as interaction site, but this merely relocated the problem. How does non-spatial mind influence spatial brain events without violating conservation laws in physics? Neuroscience progressively demonstrated that mental phenomena correlate precisely with brain states and neural processes throughout. Damage to specific brain regions eliminates corresponding mental capacities. Language, memory, emotion, perception selectively. Brain imaging shows neural activity whenever consciousness, thought, or experience occurs in subjects systematically. Chemical interventions alter mental states predictably through affecting neurotransmitter systems mechanistically. The correlation is so tight that positing separate mental substance adds no explanatory value whatsoever. The causal closure of the physical became a powerful argument against dualistic metaphysics in contemporary philosophy systematically. Physical events have sufficient physical causes. No non-physical intervention is needed to explain them completely. If mind could cause brain events, this would violate physical laws by introducing energy from nowhere. The physical world forms a causally closed system where every physical effect has physical causes. Mental causation becomes epiphenomenal. Consciousness occurs but does nothing, causally impotent and explanatorily idle. Quantum mechanics challenged classical metaphysical assumptions about determinism, causation, and objective reality independent of observation. The Copenhagen interpretation made observation essential to reality. Unobserved systems exist in superpositions of multiple states. Measurement collapsed the wave function, determining which state obtains only when observation occurs actually. This seemed to involve consciousness or observation in constituting physical reality at fundamental levels. Some interpreted this as vindicating idealism. Mind is fundamental, matter derivative or mind-dependent throughout. But most physicists rejected idealist interpretations in favor of naturalistic accounts, avoiding metaphysical conclusions entirely. Decoherence theory explains apparent collapse through interaction with environment, not through consciousness. Intervention directly. Many worlds interpretation eliminates collapse altogether. All possible outcomes occur in branching universes simultaneously. Quantum mechanics requires revising classical metaphysical assumptions, but does not support transcendent mental substance. The lesson was that physical reality is stranger than classical metaphysics imagined, not that metaphysics was right. Neuroscientific explanations of consciousness steadily advanced without requiring dualistic metaphysics to explain subjective experience clearly. Neural correlates of consciousness identify specific brain processes accompanying every conscious state reliably and consistently. Global workspace theory explains how distributed neural processes integrate into unified conscious experience. Attention, memory, and sensory processing combine through neural networks without requiring non-physical mind. The hard problem of consciousness remains controversial but seems tractable without invoking separate mental substance. Evolutionary biology explained apparent design and purpose without teleology or intelligent designer creating life intentionally and purposefully. Natural selection produces adaptive complexity through variation and differential reproduction over vast timescales systematically. Organisms appear designed because poorly adapted variants died without reproducing as successfully as better adapted ones. No purpose or goal guides evolution. It results from mechanical processes of mutation and selection. Teleological metaphysics that explain nature through final causes became scientifically obsolete and explanatorily unnecessary. The eliminative materialist position argued that folk psychology using mental concepts should be eliminated entirely eventually. Beliefs, desires, and intentions are theoretical posits in outdated psychological theory, needing replacement fundamentally. Neuroscience will develop better vocabulary for describing psychological phenomena using purely neural terms. Mental state talk will disappear like phlogiston and vital forces from scientific discourse. This radical view treated mental substance metaphysics and even mental predicates as destined for elimination completely. Critics argued that eliminativism is self-refuting. The claim requires believing it, but beliefs are supposedly illusory. More moderate positions accepted mental physical identity without eliminating mental vocabulary from explanation entirely and completely. Mental states are identical to brain states, but mental descriptions remain useful for certain explanatory purposes. The multiple realizability argument claimed that different physical systems might realize the same mental states. This suggested that mental concepts are not simply reducible to physical descriptions despite underlying physical basis. The unity of science ideal that animated positivism faced challenges from the apparent irreducibility of higher-level sciences. Biology, psychology, economics, and sociology use concepts not obviously reducible to physics and chemistry alone. Emergence suggests that complex systems have properties not predictable from their components' properties. Reduction remains a regulative ideal, but proves difficult to achieve in practice for most sciences. This opens space for limited metaphysical pluralism about levels of description without traditional substance dualism. Free will seemed threatened by deterministic physics and neuroscience showing decisions emerge from prior brain states. If every brain state has sufficient physical causes, then our choices result from antecedent conditions deterministically. Libertarian free will, requiring causally undetermined choices, contradicts scientific determinism about physical processes. Compatibilism tried to reconcile freedom with determinism by redefining freedom as absence of external constraint. But this seemed to abandon metaphysical free will that traditional dualism promised to protect philosophically. Cognitive science and artificial intelligence research suggested that intelligence and mentality arise from computational processes implementable. If mind is computation, then machines could potentially achieve consciousness and mentality without biological substrate. This functional approach to mind-supported physicalism, while allowing multiple physical realizations of mental states. Mind is what the brain does, not a separate substance inhabiting it mysteriously. Metaphysical dualism became scientifically unnecessary and philosophically problematic given functional understanding of cognition. The scientific image of humans as physical organisms contradicted the manifest image we have of ourselves reflectively. Science shows us as determined physical systems. We experience ourselves as free conscious agents with thoughts. Wilfrid Sellars addressed this tension between scientific and manifest images without resolving it definitively. Some philosophers sought to naturalize the manifest image. Others defended irreducible perspectives, requiring both images. But traditional metaphysical dualism could not solve the tension and was scientifically untenable increasingly clearly. The cumulative effect of scientific progress was to eliminate gaps where metaphysical explanation seemed necessary previously. God of the gaps arguments became increasingly desperate as science explained more without invoking transcendent causes. Consciousness, life, design, and purpose all received naturalistic explanations, even if incomplete currently. Metaphysical posits added no explanatory power to scientific accounts of phenomena requiring explanation. Science did not prove metaphysical claims false, but rendered them explanatorily idle and methodologically useless. Part 13. The Failed Revival. Why Modal Metaphysics Didn't Save the Enterprise. Analytic metaphysics revived spectacularly between 1960 and 1990, despite positivism's anti-metaphysical legacy thoroughly. Saul Kripke, David Lewis, and others developed sophisticated theories using modal logic and possible world semantics systematically. They claimed to discover necessary truths about essences, identity, and possibility through careful conceptual analysis. This new metaphysics seemed rigorous and scientifically respectable, unlike speculative system building that positivism attacked. But critics argued it merely changed metaphysics vocabulary without answering fundamental objections to the entire enterprise. Kripke's naming and necessity. In 1972, argued that some identity statements are necessary, a posteriori truths. Water is H2O is necessarily true, even though discovered through empirical investigation, not conceptual analysis alone. If water is H2O, then water could not have been anything else in any possible world whatsoever. This suggested that essences are real features of substances discoverable through scientific investigation combined with philosophy. Metaphysics could study these necessary truths about what things essentially are across all possible worlds. Rigid designation explained how proper names refer to the same individual across possible worlds necessarily. The name Aristotle rigidly designates the same person in all worlds where he exists at all. Unlike definite descriptions that might pick out different individuals in different circumstances, depending on who satisfies them. This distinction between rigid and non-rigid designators enabled sophisticated discussions of necessity, possibility, and essence. Metaphysics could analyze which properties objects have, essentially versus accidentally, through considering counterfactual scenarios carefully. David Lewis developed extreme modal realism. All possible worlds exist as real as the actual world completely. Possible worlds are not abstract objects or linguistic constructions, but concrete universes spatio-temporally isolated from each other. Modal truths reduce to truths about what happens in various possible worlds existing independently. Something is possible if it occurs in some world, necessary if in all worlds, contingent if in some, but not all worlds. This ontologically profligate theory generated incredulous stares, but provided technically elegant modal semantics throughout. Lewis's modal realism seemed like traditional metaphysics in possible worlds clothing, massive ontological claims about reality's structure. He posited infinitely many concrete universes to analyze modal vocabulary's logic and semantics rigorously. This violated Occam's razor spectacularly by multiplying entities beyond necessity for any empirical purposes. Critics asked what empirical difference it makes whether possible worlds are real or merely useful fictions. The theory seemed metaphysically extravagant without providing corresponding explanatory or predictive benefits scientifically. Ersatz modal realism tried to preserve modal logic's benefits while avoiding Lewis's ontological extravagance through abstraction. Possible worlds are abstract objects like sets of propositions or properties rather than concrete universes. These abstract entities are less ontologically costly than Lewis's concrete worlds, while serving the same theoretical purposes. But this raised questions about what grounds these abstract objects and whether they explain modality. If possible, worlds are defined by what is possible. They cannot also explain what possibility consists in fundamentally. The metaphysics of properties became central to analytic metaphysics through debates about universals and tropes systematically. Realists about universals claimed that properties like redness exist independently of particular red things instantiating them. Nominalists denied that properties exist beyond particular things and predicate use in language conventionally. Trope theory posited particular property instances rather than universal properties shared by numerically distinct particulars. These debates seemed purely metaphysical, with no empirical consequences distinguishing the competing positions at all. Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, became a sophisticated technical field investigating composition principles extensively. Under what conditions do parts compose a whole? Always, never, or only in special circumstances. Universalism claimed any parts whatsoever compose something. Nihilism denied composition ever occurs. These positions seem to differ in metaphysical commitment without differing in empirical predictions about observations. The debate appeared to be about what exists, but made no practical difference to scientific inquiry. Critics argued that analytic metaphysics simply presupposed that conceptual analysis reveals necessary truths about reality's structure. But Quine had undermined the analytic-synthetic distinction that would ground this methodology in logical analysis alone. If there are no purely conceptual truths independent of empirical facts, metaphysical analysis cannot discover necessities. The necessary a posteriori required defending synthetic a priori knowledge against empiricist critiques dating to Hume. Modal metaphysics seemed to rehabilitate rationalist metaphysics without addressing the fundamental epistemological problems that killed it. The methodology of intuitions about possible cases became central but philosophically controversial throughout analytic metaphysics extensively. Philosophers tested theories against intuitions about imagined scenarios, swamp man, zombies, teleportation, brain transplants, endlessly. But why should intuitions about fantastical scenarios reveal metaphysical truths about reality's necessary structure? Intuitions might reflect linguistic conventions, psychological biases, or cultural assumptions rather than tracking modal facts. The experimental philosophy movement showed that intuitions vary across cultures and demographics, undermining their reliability as evidence. The deflationary interpretation of modal metaphysics treated it as clarifying concepts rather than discovering reality independently. When we analyze personal identity or material composition, we are investigating our conceptual scheme's structure. This is legitimate philosophical work, but does not discover mind-independent truths about ultimate reality. Modal metaphysics becomes sophisticated conceptual analysis without making traditional metaphysical claims about transcendent structures. But this interpretation abandons metaphysics' traditional ambitions to know reality as it is in itself. Quietist critics, like Wittgenstein's followers, argued that modal metaphysics perpetuates linguistic confusion rather than resolving it. Questions about personal identity, composition, and properties rest on misunderstanding how we ordinarily use these concepts. There is no fact of the matter whether the ship of Theseus remains the same ship, only different ways of talking. Metaphysicians mistake conceptual questions for factual questions requiring investigation of reality's structure. The proper response is therapeutic dissolution, showing the questions rest on confused grammatical assumptions always. The relationship between metaphysics and science remained contentious, with no clear methodology distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate speculation. Some metaphysicians claimed to work in partnership with science, analyzing fundamental physical concepts like causation and laws. Others pursued armchair metaphysics independent of empirical investigation through pure conceptual analysis alone. But without verification or falsification, metaphysical theories seemed immune to empirical constraint and rational adjudication. This reproduced positivist worries about metaphysics being cognitively meaningless, disguised in technical modal vocabulary. The revival's ultimate failure was not refutation, but lack of clear progress or consensus, despite technical sophistication. Debates about composition, properties, and possible worlds continued indefinitely without resolution or convergence toward truth. Unlike science, metaphysics produced no cumulative knowledge or agreed-upon results across competing schools. Each position had sophisticated defenders, and no decisive arguments settled disputes definitively between them. This suggested that modal metaphysics had not overcome the fundamental problems that killed traditional metaphysics previously. Part 14. Why Metaphysics Had to Die. The Convergent Verdict. The death of metaphysics resulted from multiple independent critiques, converging on the same fundamental impossibility inherent. Every major philosophical tradition in the 20th century concluded that traditional metaphysics cannot deliver what it promises. This was not accidental or fashionable, but revealed deep structural problems with metaphysical inquiry itself. The convergence across analytic, Continental, and Pragmatist philosophy suggested that something essential was discovered about human knowledge. Metaphysics failed because it attempted what is in principle impossible given how thought and language work. The first fundamental problem was the impossibility of transcending perspective to achieve absolute objective knowledge of reality. Kant showed that all knowledge involves the subject's contribution through categories structuring possible experience entirely. We cannot know things as they are in themselves because knowing requires our conceptual apparatus. Any attempt to know reality, independent of concepts, must use concepts, contradicting the attempt itself. Human finitude and situatedness are not contingent limitations to overcome, but necessary conditions of any knowledge. The linguistic turn revealed that thought cannot escape language to compare concepts with unlinguistic reality directly. Wittgenstein showed that attempting to say what can only be shown generates nonsense rather than deep truth. Logical structure must be presupposed in meaningful statements and cannot itself be stated without circularity. We cannot stand outside language to examine how language relates to reality, because examination requires language. The very attempt to articulate language's limits uses language, violating those limits in the articulation itself. Verification demonstrated that statements lacking empirical content express nothing factual, even if grammatically well formed, perfectly. Metaphysical claims about transcendent reality cannot be verified or falsified through any possible experience or observation. While the verification principle itself failed technically, the core insight survived. Factual content requires empirical cacheability. Statements disconnected from possible experience are not false, but fail to make factual claims at all. Metaphysics systematically violates this requirement by claiming to know what transcends possible verification entirely and completely. Quine's holism showed that individual statements lack determinate meaning, independent of entire theoretical frameworks they inhabit. We cannot isolate metaphysical claims from empirical science to evaluate them separately from scientific theories. Metaphysics is either continuous with science, in which case it is science, or disconnected from it. If disconnected, it lacks the empirical constraint that makes belief revision rational and knowledge accumulation possible. The analytic-synthetic distinction that would separate metaphysics from science cannot be coherently drawn as intended. Nietzsche exposed metaphysics as disguised psychology and morality, will to power taking ascetic form systematically. Metaphysical systems reflect their creators' drives, values, and existential anxieties rather than discovering objective reality. The consistency with which metaphysics devalues this world for transcendent alternatives reveals psychological motivation. Genealogical investigation shows metaphysical concepts arose from practical needs, not from rational insight into being. This does not prove metaphysics false, but shows it serves psychological functions unrelated to truth discovery. Heidegger demonstrated that Western metaphysics forgot being by focusing on beings as present-at-hand objects for representation. The onto theological structure, making some supreme being ground, all other beings cannot think, being itself. Metaphysics history shows progressive forgetting of its original question through increasing focus on entities. Technology completes this by reducing all beings to standing reserve for manipulation and control. Overcoming metaphysics requires abandoning representational thinking for more primordial relation to being's disclosure temporally. Pragmatism showed that metaphysical disputes making no practical difference are verbal disagreements without substance underneath. If idealism and materialism have identical empirical consequences, they express the same view verbally differently. Truth is what works in practice for organizing experience and solving problems encountered in inquiry. Metaphysical theories evaluated by practical consequences mostly prove idle speculation without instrumental value. The cash value criterion eliminates metaphysics not through proving it false, but through showing it useless. Science progressively eliminated gaps where metaphysical explanation seemed necessary by providing naturalistic alternatives comprehensively. Consciousness, life, design, and purpose all received scientific explanations without invoking immaterial substances or forces. The causal closure of the physical makes mental substance explanatorily idle, even if not strictly disproven. Evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and physics together naturalize the phenomena that motivated dualistic metaphysics historically. Metaphysical posits add nothing to scientific understanding while introducing obscurities and interaction problems unsolved. These critiques converge on a single diagnosis. Metaphysics attempts to transcend the conditions making knowledge possible. It tries to know reality as it is in itself, independent of human perspective, language, and empirical constraint. But knowledge necessarily involves perspective, concepts, language, and verification through experience systematically. Absolute knowledge from nowhere would not be knowledge at all, but impossible God's eye view. Metaphysics thus pursues a conceptually incoherent ideal incompatible with how thought and language actually function. The deepest problem was metaphysics' self-refutation when it attempts to articulate its own possibility and foundations. To explain how metaphysical knowledge is possible requires metaphysical claims about mind, reality, and their relation. But these claims presuppose the very possibility they are meant to establish, creating circularity. Alternatively, they use non-metaphysical methods, undermining the claim that metaphysics provides distinctive knowledge. Either way, metaphysics cannot ground itself without begging the question or abandoning its distinctive character completely. The modal metaphysics revival failed to address these fundamental problems, merely translating them into new vocabulary. Possible worlds, metaphysics made massive ontological commitments without empirical consequences or verification methods available. Conceptual analysis through intuitions about imagined scenarios had no clear epistemology explaining how it reveals necessity. The methodology presupposed that careful thinking about concepts discloses mind-independent necessary truths about reality. But this is precisely what empiricist and critical critiques had shown to be impossible or unjustifiable rationally. The attempt to naturalize metaphysics by making it continuous with science faced a dilemma without satisfactory resolution. If metaphysics is just science, then it is not metaphysics but empirical investigation of the world. If it remains distinct from science through a priori methods, it faces all the traditional epistemological problems. The naturalized middle position lacked clear methodology, distinguishing it from either pure science or pure metaphysics. Metaphysics could not find stable ground between empiricism that eliminates it and rationalism that cannot justify it. The cumulative verdict was that metaphysics, as traditionally conceived, is impossible in principle, not merely difficult. Every attempt to articulate how we could know reality, independent of our cognitive apparatus, uses that apparatus. Every claim about absolute truth presupposes perspective-dependent language and concepts necessarily and unavoidably. Every theory about ultimate reality relies on empirically unverifiable assumptions that might be false. Metaphysics is not a failed science, but a category mistake treating its questions as factual when they are conceptual. This explains why metaphysics never achieved consensus or cumulative progress, unlike successful scientific disciplines throughout history. Metaphysical disputes continued indefinitely because they lack empirical constraints that force theory revision in science. Different metaphysical systems could not be rationally adjudicated when they differed in basic categories and principles. The field's history showed perpetual disagreement, not convergence toward truth through rational inquiry progressively. This pattern strongly suggests that metaphysical questions admit no determinate answers discoverable through philosophical investigation. The death of metaphysics was thus not arbitrary or reversible, but reflected genuine insight into knowledge's limits. We discovered that the kind of knowledge metaphysics sought is impossible, given human cognitive finitude and embeddedness. This is not skepticism about knowledge, but understanding what knowledge can and cannot achieve realistically. The mistake was treating metaphysical questions as factual questions requiring discovery rather than conceptual confusions requiring dissolution. Philosophy's task is not answering metaphysical questions, but showing why they cannot be answered as formulated. Part 15. What remains? Philosophy after metaphysics. Philosophy after metaphysics fractured into multiple distinct projects with different relationships to the traditional metaphysical enterprise entirely. Some philosophers continued doing metaphysics in deflationary mode as conceptual analysis without traditional ambitions to know reality. Others naturalized philosophy as continuous with empirical science investigating actual human cognition and language use. Still others pursued therapeutic dissolution of philosophical problems without constructive theorizing at all. No consensus emerged about what should replace metaphysics, but most agreed it could not continue unreformed. Naturalized epistemology, pioneered by Quine, made philosophy empirical study of how we actually acquire knowledge. Instead of providing a priori justifications for knowledge claims, philosophy investigates cognitive processes scientifically and empirically. Psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science reveal how sensory stimulation produces beliefs about the world. Philosophy analyzes these processes to understand knowledge without foundationalist pretensions about absolute justification. This made philosophy continuous with science, rather than its authoritative tribunal legislating from above. Conceptual analysis survived as a legitimate philosophical method, but with reduced pretensions about revealing necessary truths. Philosophers clarify concepts used in science, law, ethics, and ordinary life to resolve confusions and ambiguities. This is useful work, but does not discover metaphysical truths about reality, independent of human conceptual schemes. Conceptual analysis maps our ways of thinking rather than reality's ultimate structure beyond thinking. The distinction between analyzing concepts and discovering facts became central to philosophy's self-understanding completely. Descriptive metaphysics, articulated by Strawson, examines the conceptual scheme we actually employ, rather than seeking ultimate reality. It describes the categories and principles structuring our thought about the world as revealed in language. This is empirical investigation of human conceptual frameworks, not a priori metaphysics about reality itself. We discover that we think in terms of particular objects, properties, and causal relations fundamentally. But this reveals how we think, not necessarily how reality is independent of our thinking about it. Philosophy of language became central to analytic philosophy by examining how meaning, reference, and truth actually work. Instead of using language to talk about reality, philosophers study language itself to clarify its functioning. Semantics, pragmatics, and speech-act theory investigate linguistic phenomena empirically and theoretically together. This linguistic turn made language philosophy's subject matter rather than its transparent medium for metaphysical inquiry. Understanding language replaced understanding reality as philosophy's primary concern in much analytic work going forward. Philosophy of science emerged as major field studying scientific methodology, explanation, and theory structure without metaphysical commitments. Philosophers analyze what makes theories scientific, how evidence confirms hypotheses, what scientific explanation achieves successfully. This work is normative and conceptual, but grounded in actual scientific practice rather than a priori speculation. The relationship between philosophy of science and metaphysics remained controversial and unsettled throughout the period. Some saw it as replacing metaphysics, others as doing metaphysics differently informed by science intimately. Applied ethics flourished as philosophers addressed practical moral questions without requiring metaphysical foundations at all necessarily. Medical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, and bioethics analyze specific problems without solving meta-ethical disputes. This pragmatic approach took moral practice seriously without needing to ground it in ultimate reality. Different meta-ethical views could support similar practical conclusions about abortion, euthanasia, or justice distributively. Ethics could proceed without metaphysics just as science could, focusing on practical reasoning rather than foundations. Continental philosophy developed phenomenology, hermeneutics, and deconstruction as alternatives to both metaphysics and analytic philosophy entirely. Husserl's phenomenology described structures of consciousness without metaphysical claims about underlying reality beyond experience itself. Gadamer's hermeneutics examined interpretation and understanding historically situated in tradition and dialogue continuously. Derrida's deconstruction revealed how metaphysical oppositions depend on excluded terms they cannot acknowledge without collapse. These approaches studied human existence and meaning-making without seeking absolute truth beyond historical situatedness. The revival of virtue ethics showed that moral philosophy could proceed without meta-ethical foundations in metaphysical realism. Aristotelian ethics focused on character, practical wisdom, and human flourishing without requiring moral facts existing independently. This approach was naturalistic and empirical, grounded in human nature and social practices rather than transcendent values. Virtue ethics resonated with Pragmatist and Wittgensteinian themes about practice-embedded normativity throughout philosophy widely. Morality did not need metaphysical grounding to be rational, objective, or binding on agents. Experimental philosophy emerged in the early 21st century using empirical methods to study philosophical intuitions systematically. If metaphysics relies on intuitions about possible cases, we should investigate whether intuitions are reliable empirically. Studies showed that intuitions vary across cultures, genders, and socio-economic backgrounds significantly and systematically. This undermined the methodology of armchair metaphysics, assuming universal intuitions revealing necessary truths about reality. Philosophy required empirical grounding, rather than relying on philosophers' subjective impressions about imaginary scenarios only. Neo-pragmatism, developed by Rorty and others, radicalized the anti-representationalist implications of metaphysics' death completely. Philosophy should abandon the idea that language represents reality and truth corresponds to facts altogether. Instead, we should see language as a tool for coping with environment and coordinating with others. Truth is what our community lets us get away with asserting, not correspondence to mind-independent reality. This provoked charges of relativism, but also forced rethinking of realism and objectivity without metaphysical foundations. Quietism advocated simply dissolving philosophical problems rather than solving them through theories or analyses at all. Following later Wittgenstein, Quietists argued that philosophy should leave everything as it is after therapeutic intervention. Philosophical problems arise from linguistic confusion and dissolve when we remind ourselves how we ordinarily speak. Constructive philosophy just creates new confusions, requiring further dissolution in endless regress without progress. The proper response to metaphysical questions is showing they rest on misunderstandings, not providing alternative answers. The relationship between philosophy and science became central question for post-metaphysical philosophy without clear consensus emerging. Some argued philosophy should be continuous with science, investigating same reality using similar empirical methods. Others defended philosophy's autonomy based on conceptual analysis distinct from empirical investigation of facts. Still, others saw philosophy as meta-level reflection on science without competing with it substantively. The boundary between philosophy and science remained contested without metaphysics to mark philosophy's distinctive territory clearly. Deflationary approaches to traditional philosophical topics proliferated across multiple domains beyond metaphysics alone extensively. Deflationary theories of truth, reference, consciousness, and causation avoided robust metaphysical commitments while preserving vocabulary. Truth is just disquotation. To say snow is white is true is just to say snow is white. Reference is causal connection without mysterious intentional relations, bridging mental and physical realms metaphysically. These deflationary moves preserved practical utility while avoiding metaphysical baggage that generated pseudo-problems traditionally. The question whether metaphysics truly died or merely transformed remained contested among philosophers going forward into present. Metaphysics journals continued publishing, conferences proceeded, academic positions specified metaphysics as area of specialization still. But contemporary metaphysics differed fundamentally from traditional metaphysics in ambitions, methods, and relationship to science. It became more technical, more scientific, more modest about achieving absolute knowledge of ultimate reality. Whether this constitutes genuine metaphysics or merely conceptual analysis disguised was debated without resolution definitively. The legacy of metaphysics' death was humility about philosophy's scope and ambitions compared to earlier grandiosity. Philosophy could not legislate for science, discover reality's ultimate nature, or provide foundations for all knowledge. Its proper role was more modest, clarifying concepts, dissolving confusions, analyzing reasoning, examining presuppositions. This was important work, but did not achieve the systematic understanding of reality that metaphysics sought. Philosophy became one discipline among others, rather than first philosophy grounding all other knowledge claims authoritatively. The question whether this represented progress or decline in philosophy divided the field without clear resolution emerging. Some celebrated liberation from metaphysical pseudo-problems that wasted philosophical energy for millennia without progress. Others lamented the loss of philosophy's traditional ambitions to understand reality systematically and fundamentally. The debate reflected different conceptions of philosophy's proper aims, methods, and relationship to human flourishing. No neutral standpoint existed from which to adjudicate between these competing visions of philosophy's nature. What remained clear was that philosophy after metaphysics looked radically different from philosophy before this transformation. The questions, methods, and acceptable answers all changed in response to recognizing metaphysics' impossibility fundamentally. Whether this was death or transformation, disaster or progress, the change was profound and irreversible practically. Philosophy could not simply return to doing metaphysics as if the 20th century critiques had never happened. The death of metaphysics, whether final or temporary, marked one of the major turning points in Western philosophy's entire history.